They say the King Alpha of Iron Fang Kingdom never begged for anything in his life. He took thrones. He broke armies. He turned rivals into ash and silence. But the night they dragged his Luna across that border in chains, the night she screamed his name and he couldn't reach her, something cracked open inside Darius Vayne that no war had ever touched. This is the story of what a man becomes when the one thing keeping him human gets ripped away. Stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments and let me know you're watching. If this hits you somewhere real, you already know what to do. The Iron Fang Kingdom did not have soft borders. Every territory that brushed against its edges understood this the way a man understands a knife at his throat. Not through reasoning, not through diplomacy, but through the specific quality of silence that follows a warning delivered without words. The mountain passes in the north were stacked with the remnants of armies that had tested this understanding and found it absolute. The southern marshlands still carried the burned-out hulls of 3 different enemy encampments that had tried to claim the river crossing during the Second Territorial War. Even the eastern trading roads, where merchants moved freely and coin changed hands with something approaching normalcy, had watchtowers every half-mile staffed by soldiers who had personally survived enough campaigns to recognize a threat before it finished breathing. This was the kingdom Darius Vayne had inherited from his father at 19, a crown soaked in blood and expectation, a throne that had been won and held and defended through a philosophy so brutally simple it bordered on scripture among the Iron Fang packs. Strength is the only language every enemy understands. He had spent the next 11 years proving his father right. The Alpha King stood 6'4" with the kind of build that came not from training rooms but from decades of actual physical punishment, hauling siege equipment through winter mud, taking blades across his ribs and collarbone and left forearm in engagements where the outcome was never guaranteed, running through forests for hours at full shift when the wolf inside him needed something the throne room couldn't give. His hair was black and cropped short on the sides, longer on top where it fell in rough lines across his forehead when he wasn't paying attention to it. His eyes were a particular shade of amber that his enemies had described in dispatches as the color of something burning down. He had a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same granite as the Iron Fang Mountains, and a scar that ran from the outer edge of his left brow down to the high point of his cheekbone, a souvenir from the Battle of Greystone Pass, where he had personally killed 4 enemy commanders in a span of 20 minutes. He was 29 years old, and the people who studied kingdoms for a living had written that he was the most dangerous alpha alive. None of them had ever met Celine Arden. The peace gathering had been her idea. That was the thing Darius kept turning over in his chest in the weeks before the ceremony. Not with resentment, never that, but with the particular weight of a man who recognizes that his instincts and his love are pulling in opposite directions and is choosing, consciously and deliberately, to follow his love. He had built his kingdom on strategic dominance. She had been trying, quietly and persistently, and with a patience that sometimes made him want to grip her face in both hands and ask her where it came from, to teach him that there were things strategic dominance couldn't hold. "You can't rule a kingdom of wolves who are afraid of you forever," she had told him 6 months ago, standing at the window of the war room with her arms crossed and that particular angle to her chin that meant she wasn't backing down. Fear keeps the peace for a generation, maybe 2. Then someone gets brave or gets desperate, and you spend the next 20 years fighting the same war your father fought. My father's wars kept the territory intact. Your father's wars killed 40,000 men and created 3 generations of orphans who grew up wanting revenge. She hadn't raised her voice. She never had to. I'm not telling you to put down your weapons, Darius. I'm telling you to pick up something else, too. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a healer from the Arden bloodline, old wolf aristocracy, technical rivals to the Iron Fang line by treaty, if not by active conflict. She had come to the kingdom 18 months ago under a diplomatic provision, a gesture of interpack cooperation that had been largely symbolic at the time. She had brown hair the color of autumn bark that she kept braided over one shoulder when she was working and loose when she was off duty, which was almost never because she worked constantly. She was lean and medium height and had hands that were perpetually marked with the small burns and cuts that came from handling medicinal compounds without caring enough about herself to wear proper protection. She had green eyes with a thin ring of gold at the center that only showed up in certain light. She had also, within 3 weeks of arriving in the Iron Fang court, correctly diagnosed a condition in Darius's head of strategy that 2 military physicians had missed entirely, walked into Darius's private war room without an appointment to tell him about it, and when he had told her to get out before she finished her second sentence, had simply pulled up a chair and kept talking. He had let her finish. He hadn't been able to explain why then. He understood now. The mate bond had been working on him before he had the vocabulary for it. A pull in the chest that he had initially categorized as irritation, and then as something he didn't have a clean category for, and finally, one evening in the Eastern Garden, when she laughed at something one of the junior healers said, and the sound of it moved through him like heat moving through iron, as the thing it actually was. His Luna. His. In a way that went deeper than ownership, deeper than rank, deeper than even the wolf blood that recognized it before his human mind caught up. He had told her in the least romantic way a man had probably ever communicated a mate bond in the history of his bloodline. He had simply stopped her in a corridor one morning, stood in front of her so she couldn't walk around him, and said, "You know what this is." She had looked at him for a long moment with those gold-ringed eyes and said, "I've known for 2 months. I was waiting for you to figure it out." He had kissed her right there in the corridor, in front of 3 passing soldiers and a kitchen hand, and hadn't particularly cared. That had been 14 months ago. The peace gathering was her project, her architecture, her patient negotiation with packs that had spent decades viewing the Iron Fang line as either an enemy or an overlord, never an equal. She had spent 4 months traveling to the border territories with a small escort, sitting in council rooms and eating at the same tables as alpha families who had lost sons to Iron Fang campaigns, listening to grievances that Darius would have called tactical weakness, treating their sick and their injured without payment and without political calculation. "You're going to get yourself killed," he had told her before she left for the 3rd border trip. "I've had 2 very polite death threats and 1 genuinely uncomfortable dinner. I'm fine." 2 death threats. Very polite ones. Almost apologetic. She had been packing a medical case while she talked, her attention divided in the way it always was when she was doing something she considered more important than the conversation. "No one actually wants more war, Darius. They want to not be afraid of you. Those are different problems. I don't want them comfortable. Comfortable territories get lazy about tribute." She had stopped packing and looked at him directly then, and there was something in her expression that wasn't quite frustration and wasn't quite sadness, but sat somewhere in the territory between them. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm working on." He hadn't asked her to explain. He had watched her go and stood at the war room window for a long time afterward, feeling something in his chest that he couldn't have named and wouldn't have tried to. The peace gathering was scheduled for the last full moon of autumn, a sacred timing in wolf culture, when the territorial instincts that drove pack conflict were meant to be set aside. Celine had chosen the location with typical precision. The Hollow Ground, a valley in neutral territory between Iron Fang and 3 border kingdoms, bordered on all sides by old-growth forest and a river that ran clear and cold even in autumn. The site had historical significance among the elder packs, something about the water, something about the way the land sat, and she had used that significance with the same quiet strategic intelligence she used for everything, anchoring the gathering in tradition so that refusing to attend became a statement against the old ways rather than simply against Darius. 12 packs had confirmed. 3 of them were former enemies. Darius had brought 60 soldiers and told himself he was doing it for her safety. He had also assigned 12 of his best to her personal detail without telling her because he knew she would argue, and had briefed them privately with a bluntness that left no room for misunderstanding. She does not get hurt. If she gets hurt, I will hold every one of you personally accountable, and you understand exactly what that means. They had understood. The hollow ground was everything she had promised it would be. The valley opened up between tree lines in a wide, flat stretch, with the river at one end and enough open space in the center for a gathering fire large enough to be seen from the hills above. Delegations from 8 packs had arrived by midday, setting up camps in the loose ring formation that the old tradition specified. No pack at another's back, everyone equidistant from the center, a physical arrangement that removed hierarchy from the geometry of the space. Darius had watched it come together from the higher ridge above the valley with his second-in-command, Magnus Hale, standing at his shoulder. "It's working," Magnus had said, in a tone that Darius had catalogued at the time as neutral observation. She built it well. She's remarkable, my king, for a healer from a rival bloodline. Darius had looked at him then. A brief glance, something in the phrasing sitting slightly wrong in a way he hadn't examined closely enough. Magnus was 43, broad-shouldered and gray at the temples, a war commander who had served under Darius's father and then under Darius for 11 years. He was efficient, practical, not given to compliments. She is, Darius had said, and left it there. By evening, the gathering fire was lit, and the delegations were at the center, representatives from each pack standing in the traditional circle formation. Selene moved through the space with an ease that Darius still found slightly astonishing. She had no political title, no military rank, no history with most of these people beyond 4 months of careful relationship building. And yet she moved through the circle of alpha representatives like someone who had been born to this specific function, pausing to speak with each delegation, remembering names and specific details that she had filed away from earlier visits, making each group feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with flattery and everything to do with genuine attention. Darius stood at the outer ring with his guards and watched her, and felt, in the particular way he felt things that he usually didn't have language for, something that might have been pride and might have been something even more exposed than that. The feeling of a man watching someone he loves do the thing they were built for, and understanding for the first time what that actually looks like. The ceremony began with the traditional lighting exchange, each pack adding wood to the central fire, while a representative spoke a formal acknowledgement of the other packs present. It was old protocol, older than the specific conflicts that had divided many of these bloodlines, and there was something in the watching of it that even Darius, who was not given to sentiment about ceremony, found he couldn't entirely dismiss. He had moved slightly closer to the circle by then, close enough to see Selene's face when she looked across the fire at him. She had caught his gaze and held it for a moment, and the corner of her mouth had lifted in the small, specific smile she gave him when she knew he was doing something that cost him, attending, participating, allowing himself to be present in something he didn't fully control, and appreciated it without making a production of the appreciation. He had looked back at her for 3 full seconds, which for Darius Vane in a public setting was the equivalent of a declaration. Then the first scream came from the tree line. It happened in the specific way that catastrophes always did, not with the slow buildup that the training scenarios prepared you for, but with a sudden violent compression of time and space that dropped the present moment directly into chaos. The screams from the eastern tree line hit the gathering the way a stone hits still water, and before the first ripple of understanding moved through the crowd, the masked figures were already at the edge of the firelight. There were more than 30 of them. Darius registered this in the first half-second with the part of his mind that never stopped counting. Black clothing, masks that covered everything above the jaw, movement that was coordinated and pre-planned and operating on a signal he hadn't seen given. They moved in a pattern that isolated the center of the circle from the outer ring where his soldiers stood, cutting between the delegations with a precision that spoke of days, maybe weeks of preparation, of someone who had studied the geometry of this gathering and built an assault around it. Guards! He was already moving, already shifting the weight of his body toward the center, his wolf rising so fast it hit his chest like a fist from the inside. The masked figures didn't try to fight the outer ring. They bypassed it. They moved through the civilian delegations with enough force to scatter them, not killing, not yet, pushing bodies aside and creating enough chaos and screaming to turn the center into confusion, and converged on one specific point, on Selene. He watched it happen from 40 feet away, with his soldiers surging around him and the fire between them, and later he would understand that the entire assault had been designed around this exact moment, the distance, the fire, the bodies. But in the moment, all he processed was that 3 figures had reached her before his guards could close, that she had turned and fought, because she would, because she always would, that she had gotten her elbow across one mask and drawn the knife she always carried in her left boot and put it into a second attacker's forearm before the third got his arm around her throat. Darius! His name in her voice. That specific pitch of it, the one she had never used before, the one that was not a call for help so much as an acknowledgement of him, of the fact that he was there and she saw him and she needed him to hear her. He shifted mid-stride, fully, the wolf hitting the ground and covering the distance in the kind of burst that the bodies of King Alphas were built for, enormous and fast, faster than anything that size had a right to be. And he was at the edge of the fire, and he could see her face, could see her fighting, could see her eyes find him across the chaos. And then the flash went off. It was a silver compound. He understood it afterward when the searing white light faded and his vision came back in broken pieces, and he was on his knees with both hands on the ground, the wolf shrinking back from the chemical burn that had hit him like a wall. Silver compounds in liquid form were rare and expensive and illegal in most territories. Whoever had designed this had resources and specific knowledge about how to stop a King Alpha at full shift. He got back to his feet in 8 seconds. He knew because he counted. She was gone. The eastern tree line showed movement disappearing into the dark. His guards were already in pursuit. He could hear them crashing through the undergrowth. And he was running before his vision had fully cleared, wolf and man both operating on something that had nothing to do with strategy or discipline and everything to do with the very simple fact that she had said his name and he had not gotten there. He ran for 2 hours. His best trackers ran with him, and he barely registered them. He registered the trail. Her scent, faint, and then fainter, and then cut in a way that meant they had transferred to horses or a vehicle at the border road. And then the specific physical sensation of that trail ending at the territorial line of the Draven Kingdom's eastern reach. He stood at the border marker in the dark, still half-shifted, breathing in raw pulls, the wolf in him screaming at a pitch that had no sound. Magnus arrived at his shoulder 20 minutes later, breathing hard from the run, and said nothing for a moment, then, "My king, we should fall back and regroup. The Draven border guard has already activated. If we cross now, it's a declaration of war. It's already a war. We need to be strategic. If she's across that border..." "She is across that border." His voice came out wrong, flat and very quiet in a way that was worse than shouting. "They took her across that border in front of 60 of my soldiers, and she's across it now, and you're standing here telling me to fall back." Magnus had the sense to be quiet. Darius stood at the border marker and looked at the dark line of the Draven territory and breathed. By dawn, the declaration arrived by messenger, a formal document, sealed with the Draven royal mark, delivered by a rider who had enough nerve to approach the Iron Fang camp and enough self-preservation instinct to keep his voice steady when he read it aloud. Celine Arden, Luna of Iron Fang, was a prisoner of the Draven Kingdom. Her release would be granted under one condition. Darius Vayne would surrender his throne, his title, and his kingdom's military command to the Draven crown. He would have 7 days to respond. The messenger finished reading and stood very still and waited. Darius looked at the document for a long time. The camp had gone completely silent. 60 soldiers, trackers, the remnants of 12 pack delegations, all of them watching the Alpha King read the terms of his own surrender in the gray light of early morning. He handed the document to Magnus without expression. "Send it back," he said. "My king." "I said send it back." He turned toward the camp and began walking. "We're not responding. We're moving." "Moving where?" He stopped, turned back, looked at Magnus with those amber eyes that had been described, in enemy dispatches, as the color of something burning down. "Into Draven territory," he said, "with everything we have." "That's... My king, that is exactly what they want. They want you to abandon strategy. They want you to come in blind and furious, and I know what they want." The flatness in his voice had a new quality now, something that had moved past the edge of cold into a register that made the soldiers nearest to him take a half step back without meaning to. "They want me to choose between her and my kingdom." He paused. "Let that sit. I don't make that choice. I take both back. Prepare the war column." Magnus opened his mouth, closed it. The messenger from Draven had gone pale. Darius walked into the camp and did not look at the border marker again. The war column moved in 3 hours. 94 soldiers, his fastest scouts on the flanks, supply enough for a week in enemy territory. Not an army. An army would take 3 days to assemble, and he didn't have 3 days, wouldn't take 3 days, had made the calculation of speed over numbers with the precision of a man who had run enough campaigns to understand that the window between a prisoner's capture and their utility to the captor was the most dangerous window there was. He rode at the front and did not speak. Cale Voss, his head of intelligence, 26 years old, lean and dark-eyed, and the best tracker in the kingdom, rode up beside him 3 miles into the Draven borderlands. "My king, I have to tell you something. Tell me while we move." "The ambush!" Cale kept his voice low enough that only Darius could hear it over the sound of hooves. The positioning was too perfect. The way they cut the inner ring from the outer, they knew the layout. They knew where your soldiers would be standing. They knew where the Luna would be standing. Darius said nothing. "That information came from inside the gathering's planning process," Cale continued. "The route, the formation, the specific arrangement of delegations, that was never posted publicly. It was shared internally with the Planning Council 3 weeks ago." "How many people saw the full layout?" Cale was quiet for a moment. 6. Names. Yourself, the Luna, her senior healer Mara, the logistics commander Petra Vane, your cousin, the border liaison for the Eastern Territories. He paused. And Magnus Hale. Darius rode in silence for a long moment. The trees moved past on either side. The sky above was the flat gray of early morning, the sun still behind the mountains, and the air had the particular cold weight of deep autumn in the Northern Territories. "You're not telling me it was Magnus," he said finally. "I'm telling you I can't rule it out. Magnus has served my house for 22 years. I know. He was my father's war commander. I know." Cale's voice stayed even, careful, the tone of a man delivering information he would rather not deliver. "I'm not making an accusation. I'm telling you the logic of it. The people with access to that layout are the 6 I named. Someone in that list sold the details of the gathering. The ambush was built around those details. That's where I am." Darius looked at the road ahead and said nothing more for a long time. He was thinking about Magnus's voice on the ridge the night before. "She's remarkable, my king, for a healer from a rival bloodline. The specific texture of it, the thing in the phrasing that had sat wrong and that he had let go." He was thinking about Magnus arriving at the border marker 20 minutes after the pursuit began. 20 minutes when his best soldiers had been on Darius's heels within 3. He was thinking about how smoothly Magnus had transitioned from the ambush into logistics, how quickly he had moved to the question of strategy, of holding back, of not crossing the border. They want you to come in blind and furious. Was that advice? Or was that information? Was that a war commander telling his king the enemy's game? Or was that a man who knew the enemy's game because he had helped design it, feeling out how well the trap was working? Darius's jaw tightened. He didn't have proof. He needed proof, because acting without it would split his command at the worst possible moment, and splitting the command was the second thing that would kill this mission. The first was not moving fast enough, but he filed it. Stored it in the part of his mind that kept things it wasn't done with yet. Let it sit there next to Magnus's face and Magnus's voice and that 20-minute gap. He would come back to it. The first Draven border patrol hit them 2 miles inside enemy territory. A squad of 12, probably a standing patrol rather than a response force, which meant the main defensive reaction was still forming behind them. Darius shifted before the patrol finished identifying itself. The fight lasted 90 seconds. He didn't kill any of them. He needed them to carry information back. The specific information that the Iron Fang King had entered Draven territory in wolf form and was not stopping. This was a message, not a massacre, and he understood the difference even in the state he was in, even with the part of him that had been quiet and cold and contained since the border marker reaching now for something with edges. He shifted back and kept riding. Cale rode up again at the next tree line. "Message intercept from the scouts. Draven's eastern garrison is mobilizing. We'll have a standing army between us and the fortress by nightfall." "How many?" 300 at minimum, probably more. 94 against 300. Darius did the math with the part of his brain that never stopped doing it. Bad odds in a conventional engagement. Better odds for a fast, targeted operation that didn't try to hold ground, but moved through it. He had done harder numbers with fewer men. "We don't engage the garrison. We find the route that bypasses it." "Through the cradle," Cale said. "It's the only gap. Rocky terrain, bad for horses, will take twice as long." "Then we start now." "The fortress, my king. Do we know for certain she's there?" Darius looked at him. I know, he said. And he did know. The way he knew where she was in a room without looking. The mate bond, that biological absolute that ran deeper than any intelligence report. She was north, she was in the dark, and she was afraid but not broken. He could feel the specific texture of her fear across the distance, the kind of fear that was being held back by something fierce, and she was waiting. She was waiting for him. She's at the fortress, he said. Move. The cradle route took them through terrain that was exactly what Kale had promised. Loose shale and narrow ledges and 2 river crossings that nearly cost them 3 horses. Darius led them through it with the patient brutality of a man who had run worse terrain in worse conditions, and by mid-afternoon they had bypassed the garrison's perimeter and were looking at the beginning of the northern approach to the Draven heartland. He called a halt in the tree cover and let the soldiers breathe and water the horses, and stood at the edge of the tree line looking north. Magnus appeared at his shoulder. The garrison will know we bypassed them within the hour, Magnus said. They'll reposition. We might have a window, say... Why did it take you 20 minutes to reach the border marker last night? Darius said. The air between them changed. Darius didn't move, didn't look at him, kept his gaze on the tree line ahead. My king. The Eastern Run. My best soldiers were on my heels in under 3 minutes. You're not my best soldier anymore, I know that, but you were never 20 minutes slow. He paused. Where were you? The silence from Magnus was 11 seconds long. Darius counted. I was managing the rear of the pursuit, making sure the camp didn't scatter. Who ordered you to manage the rear? Standard protocol. My protocol doesn't put my war commander at the rear of a pursuit for his king's kidnapped mate. He turned his head then, just enough to bring Magnus into his peripheral vision. It puts him 10 feet behind me. Magnus said nothing. I'm not making an accusation, Darius said, and he heard in his own voice the specific flatness of a man who has made the accusation completely, internally, and is extending one final window for the truth to walk through before he closes it. I'm asking where you were. Magnus was quiet for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated, and Darius watched it from the corner of his eye with the attention of a man who had spent 11 years reading faces under pressure. What he saw there was not the controlled blankness of an innocent man being accused. What he saw was the specific quality of calculation, a man running options, weighing positions, deciding what could be salvaged and how. I'll answer your question fully, Magnus said carefully. When we return to the kingdom, and I can speak with you privately, there are things you need to hear that can't be said in open camp. You'll answer it now. My king, you'll answer it now, or you'll ride back to the kingdom under guard, and I'll get the answer from you when I return with my Luna. He turned to face him fully then, and whatever was in his eyes made 3 nearby soldiers step involuntarily outward. Last chance, Magnus. Magnus looked at him for a long moment. And what he did then, what he chose, in that moment, with 11 seconds of silence already spent and the window narrowing, was not what an innocent man would do. He reached for his sword. It was a draw that Magnus had made 1,000 times in training, in campaigns, in 11 years of service, and it was fast, genuinely fast for a man his age. But Darius had been waiting for it with the stillness of a man who already knows what's coming, and he caught Magnus's sword arm at the wrist before the blade cleared the scabbard and had him locked and off balance and against the nearest tree in a single movement that was over before the watching soldiers had fully processed what they were seeing. Magnus's back hit the bark. Darius's hand was at his throat. Not crushing, not yet, just present, just there. The camp had gone silent. Tell me, Darius said, very quietly. Magnus looked at him with something that had moved past calculation into something raw. His jaw worked. His eyes, and this was the thing that landed like a second blow, showed something that was almost relief. The specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something too heavy for too long. It wasn't supposed to go this far, Magnus said. Quiet, flat, the voice of a man who is done running from something. The silence that followed was absolute. The Draven contact. I made it 2 years ago, during the Eastern Campaign. They offered terms, territory, gold, insurance, they called it. Insurance against Iron Fang losing the North. I told myself it was intelligence gathering. I told myself I was playing both sides for the kingdom's benefit. His throat worked against Darius's hand. I shared the layout of the gathering. I told myself no one would be hurt, that it would be a diplomatic capture, a bargaining chip, a political solution. You sold her, Darius said. The words came out without inflection, without volume, the very specific quiet of something at its absolute limit. I told myself, you sold her. He said it 3 times, each word separate and precise, not louder, but heavier, the weight of each one landing in the silence of the camp with the finality of something structural giving way. 22 years. You sat at my father's table for 22 years, and you sold my Luna to a Draven cage. Magnus closed his eyes. The trees stood still. The horses had gone quiet. 60 soldiers stood in a ring around the 2 of them, and nobody breathed. Darius released him, stepped back. And the stepping back was somehow more frightening than the hand at the throat. The controlled withdrawal of a man who is pulling himself back from something that, if it finished, would not leave anything standing. He looked at Magnus for a long moment. Cage him, he said to Chaol, without raising his voice. Hands and feet. He eats, he drinks, he sleeps. Nothing happens to him until I bring her home and deal with him properly. Yes, my king. He turned back toward the northern tree line. My king. Magnus's voice from behind him, unsteady now, stripped of the calculation. The fortress. There's something you need to know about why they took her, about her blood, and what Lucien Draven believes it can do. What he's planning. I know what he's planning. He had put it together on the ride. The pieces of the intelligence reports about the Draven North, the old stories about Lycan lineages and dormant bloodlines, the specific deliberateness of taking Selene rather than killing her. I know why he wants her. Then you know what the Blood Moon ceremony. How long until the Blood Moon? Silence. Magnus. 4 days, Magnus said. The next Blood Moon rises in 4 days. If Lucien forces the ritual before then, if he binds her power to the awakening, he won't. You can't know. Darius turned his head, just slightly, just enough. He won't, he said again, because I will take that fortress apart stone by stone before the moon rises. He began walking north. Behind him, Chaol gave quiet, efficient orders. Chains clinked, horses shifted. The column reformed with the specific automatic discipline of soldiers who had followed this man long enough to understand that when he moved like this, with that particular quality of controlled purpose that was somehow more frightening than rage, the only rational position was directly behind him. 3 hours later, when they crested the ridge above the valley approach to the Draven heartland, the Iron Fang soldiers got their first look at what they were walking toward. The fortress sat in the center of a frozen lake, approached by a single stone causeway and ringed by walls that had been built 3 centuries ago with the specific intention of holding against exactly the kind of assault Darius was contemplating. Torchlight moved on the walls in patterns that indicated active watch rotation. The garrison they had bypassed was still behind them, but would have the approach blocked within 6 hours. Chaol came up beside him. My king. A pause. That's not a fortress we can take in a night with 94 soldiers. I'm not taking it in a night, Darius said. He studied the causeway, the walls, the placement of the torch rotations, the lines of the approach with the particular focus of a man cataloging everything at once. I'm going in at dawn. Small group. Fast and silent. Small group meaning me, you, and 6 who can keep up. He paused. The rest hold the causeway approach and keep the garrison off our back. With 87 soldiers holding a garrison of 300. For an hour, Darius said. They only have to hold it for an hour. Chaol was quiet. She's in there, Darius said. Flat. Certain. The mate bond pulling north, pulling toward the center of that fortress, with a persistence that was like a hook behind his sternum. And in 4 days the Blood Moon rises, and a Draven king tries to use her to wake something that should stay buried. I have 4 days and 87 soldiers and a commander in chains who knew about this for 2 years while I sat at the same table as him and called him my war council. He exhaled, slow and hard. So, yes, small group, fast and silent, dawn. Chaol nodded, didn't argue further. The training held. Darius turned away from the ridge and went back to the camp to prepare. He had not eaten since before the ceremony, had not slept, had run 20 miles in wolf form and ridden another 30 on horseback and chained his own war commander in a forest in enemy territory, and the only thing in him that was still moving with full capacity was the thing that had been running since the moment she screamed his name, and he didn't reach her in time. He sat at the edge of the camp alone, back against a tree, and let the wolf inside him go to the only thought it had been holding since the border marker. "I'm coming." The message was wordless, pushed through the mate bond with everything he had, across the frozen lake and the fortress walls, through whatever room they were keeping her in, into whatever she was carrying right now. "I'm coming." Hold. He waited. And across the distance, faint and real and unmistakably hers, something came back. Not words, not even a clear feeling, just the specific quality of someone who has heard you, who has felt you across the dark, who is gripping that signal with both hands and not letting go. She was still fighting. Of course she was. Darius pressed the back of his head against the tree bark and looked up at the sky through the branches and let himself, for exactly 3 full seconds, feel everything he had been holding at arm's length since the border marker. The specific terror of a man who has found the one thing he will not survive losing and is watching a clock count down to the window where losing becomes possible. 3 seconds. Then he put it away, stood up, and went to brief his assault team for the approach to the frozen fortress. He had 4 days. He intended to need 3. But when Cale came to him an hour before dawn with a face that had gone carefully, specifically neutral in the way it only did when the intelligence was very bad, Darius understood that his 4 days had just become significantly less. "Scouts came back," Cale said, "from the eastern approach to the fortress. How many in the garrison response?" "That's not—" Cale stopped, restarted. "My king, the blood moon ceremony, the timing we were told. 4 days. That was the original schedule." Cale met his eyes. "They've moved it up." The camp was silent. "The ritual begins at midnight tomorrow night." The air went out of the clearing. "Not 4 days," Darius said. 32 hours. "Yes." He stood very still, looked at the dark line of the fortress across the frozen water. 32 hours. 1 assault crossing, 94 soldiers against a garrison that was now closing in from behind. A war commander in chains who had given him everything except the one piece of information that would have changed his calculation entirely. He turned back to his assault team. "New timeline," he said. "We move in 2 hours." "My king, 2 hours means a night crossing of the—" "I know what it means." He began walking toward the causeway. "Wake everyone. We move in 2 hours." And somewhere in the frozen fortress across the lake, in a room that smelled of ice and old stone, Selena Arden pressed her back against a wall and closed her eyes and felt something move through the mate bond like heat moving through iron, urgent and certain, and so specifically him that her breath caught. He's here. She opened her eyes in the dark. The guard outside her door shifted his weight. The chains on her wrists were still locked. The blood moon was 32 hours away, and Lucian Draven had told her, in very precise terms, exactly what the ritual required and what would happen if she kept refusing. She looked at the ceiling of the cell. He's here, she thought again. And the thought had a different quality now. Not comfort, not relief, but warning. Because she knew Darius, knew the specific weight of what she'd felt come through the bond, and she knew what it meant about the state he was in and what he was about to walk into. She knew something else, too. Something she had learned in the 3 days since her capture. Something she had been quietly, methodically putting together from the pieces of overheard conversation and the specific questions Lucian had asked her about her blood and her lineage and what she knew about her grandmother's bloodline. Something that changed the stakes of the blood moon ritual in a way that Darius didn't know yet. Something that, if it was true, meant this was not just about her. It was about what would be unleashed if anyone, friend or enemy, used her blood to wake what was sleeping under the northern mountains. She looked at the chains on her wrists and began very carefully testing the weakest link. The chain link snapped at the 3rd hour. Not all the way through. A hairline fracture in the iron, a micro-weakness that Celine had found with her fingers in the dark the way she found everything, by touch and patience, and the specific refusal to stop moving. She filed it away and left the chain looking intact. Let the guard outside her door believe what the dim torchlight told him. She had learned this from her grandmother. Not the escape technique specifically, but the principle underneath it, that the most dangerous thing a captured woman could do was let her captors see her thinking. The cell was cut from the fortress's northern foundation, which meant the stone stayed cold even when the torches were lit. A specific, penetrating cold that had nothing to do with air temperature and everything to do with the age of the rock and what it had absorbed over centuries. The window was a slit in the outer wall, too narrow for a body but wide enough to read the sky. And Celine had been reading it every hour since they brought her here. The blood moon was 32 hours away. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed through her nose and let her mind do the thing it did when the situation required it. Strip away what she felt and inventory what she knew. What she knew. Lucien Draven had taken her for her blood specifically. Not her position, not her political value as Darius's mate, though both of those were useful to him. Her blood. Her grandmother's bloodline, the Arden lineage, which was older than the Iron Fang dynasty and older than the Draven kingdom, and carried something in it that most people who studied bloodlines had forgotten how to look for. What she knew, the ancient Lycan army buried under the northern mountains, was not a metaphor. The old texts she had studied during her healer training, texts that most practitioners dismissed as folklore, described a hibernation ritual used 3 centuries ago to preserve an army too powerful to be destroyed and too dangerous to be left active. The ritual had been sealed with a blood binding, a specific bloodline's blood. An Arden healer had been the one to seal it. What she understood, 3 days into her captivity and 2 conversations into Lucien's careful, almost academic explanations of why she was here. Her blood could unseal it just as easily as it had sealed it, if the right ceremony was used at the right lunar alignment. What she also understood, and what Lucien did not know she understood, the army that would wake was not controllable. The texts were explicit on this. The Lycan bloodline that had been sealed was old strain, pre-civilization, operating on territorial instinct so deep and so absolute that no living alpha, not Darius, not Lucien, not anyone, had the dominance to command it. It would wake, and it would move, and it would kill everything in its path until it ran out of path. Lucien thought he could leash it. She had seen this kind of certainty before, in men who confused power with control, who looked at something enormously dangerous and saw a weapon rather than a catastrophe. She needed to get word to Darius before he reached the fortress. Not because she needed rescuing, she was actively working on that front, but because the information changed the entire shape of what was coming. This wasn't just a hostage extraction. This was a containment problem. The mate bond pulsed. She felt him like a coal in her chest, steady and hot and moving north. She could feel the direction of him, the specific pressure of his focus, which had a quality she recognized from the moments when he'd gone fully into command mode during a crisis. Stripped down to function, operating below feeling. She had seen him like that twice. Both times it had been terrifying from the outside. She pressed her hand flat against the stone wall and pushed back through the bond. Not words. The bond didn't carry words. Just sensation, intention, the specific texture of "I know you're coming and you need to hear me first," and held it until she felt something shift in the quality of what came back from his direction. A pause. A recognition. Then the relentless, north-moving pressure resumed. She exhaled. The door opened. Not the guard. The movement was too smooth, too deliberate, and the figure that stepped through carried a single candle rather than a torch, which meant it was a private visit rather than an official one. Lucien Draven was 35 and would have been considered handsome by the kind of objective assessment that ignored what a person's face did when they were being watched. He was lean and long-limbed with sharp features and silver-gray eyes that had the particular flatness of a man who had trained himself out of visible reaction. He wore no crown in private. She had noticed this, the way he shed the symbols of authority in one-on-one settings, as if he found them more useful as theater than as truth. He set the candle on the small shelf by the door and looked at her with an expression that was almost collegial. "You haven't eaten," he said. "I'm not hungry." The cold suppresses appetite. It's not a comfortable cell. I want you to know that's not intentional cruelty. The northern foundation is simply the most secure location in the fortress. I appreciate the clarification. Her voice came out flat and precise. Was there something you needed, or did you come to discuss the architecture? He pulled the single stool from the corner and sat on it, which put him at her eye level rather than standing over her, and she noted this the way she noted everything, as information, as a choice, as a tell. He wanted the posture of equals. He wanted, for reasons she was still mapping, for her to see him as reasonable. I want to explain something, he said. You've explained it twice already. I want to explain the part I left out. He folded his hands in his lap. The candlelight caught the planes of his face and left the hollows dark. The army under the mountain isn't just military capacity. It's a deterrent. The three kingdoms on the eastern reaches, you know their names, you've worked their borders. They're building. They've been building for 5 years, quietly, the kind of buildup that precedes a war no one's officially declared yet. When they move together, and they move against the northern territories first, including yours, including mine, and Darius's. He paused. Your mate's kingdom would fall in the second wave. The Iron Fang military is formidable, but it's designed for single-front engagements. A three-kingdom coalition from the east is a different problem. She looked at him without expression. Let the silence do the work it did when a person was making their case and needed you to fill the space. The army under the mountain, he continued, would change the strategic calculation, not to deploy it, to demonstrate that it exists, that it can be woken. The Eastern kingdoms have their own old histories. They would understand the message. A deterrent, she said. Yes. You're asking me to believe, she said carefully, that you kidnapped me from a peace ceremony, chained me in a frozen cell, and are planning to use my blood in a ritual to wake a 3-century-old Lycan army as a deterrent. I'm asking you to consider the larger picture beyond your current discomfort. The specific quality of his reasonableness was the most frightening thing about him. She had been in difficult rooms before, had sat across from men who used cruelty as a first language, and she could manage that. Cruelty had patterns. This, the calm, the apparent logic, the collegial candlelight, required a different kind of management. The army can't be controlled, she said. Something shifted in his eyes. Very small, very fast. The old texts are... I've read the same texts you have, she said. Probably more of them. My grandmother's library had the Ardennes copies, which predate the versions in your archives by 60 years. The original binding wasn't designed to produce a controllable weapon. It was designed to contain something that had already killed 4 kingdoms. She held his gaze. The Ardennes healer who performed the original ritual spent the last 3 years of her life documenting what she'd sealed. She was not optimistic about anyone opening it again. Lucian was quiet. You don't know this, he said finally. I've known it for 2 days. I've been deciding whether telling you would make things better or worse. She let that sit. I've decided it makes things better, because what you're planning will kill everyone. Yours, Ardennes, Iron Fangs, the Eastern Kingdoms you're worried about. Everything in the Northern Territories gets flattened, and there's no one left to appreciate your strategic deterrent. The candle flame moved in some invisible draft. Lucian looked at her for a long time with those flat silver eyes, and she watched him run the calculation. She could almost see it, the thing that happened behind a certain kind of face when the architecture of a plan starts showing cracks. How certain are you? He said quietly. Certain enough that I'm telling you, which should tell you something about how certain I am. She kept her voice even. Stop the ceremony. Let me go. Tell Darius I was treated well and negotiate whatever political settlement you actually need. That's the path where everyone is still alive in a year. And if I don't stop it, then my mate tears this fortress down, and whatever happens after that happens to everyone. The silence went long and specific. Lucien stood, picked up the candle. His face had gone back to controlled. I'll consider what you've said, he said. That's not... I'll consider it. He moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. For what it's worth, Luna Celine, in a different arrangement, I think you would have been a significant political mind. It's an unfortunate waste. He left. The door locked. She sat in the dark and breathed through her nose and let the cold do what it did. And then she went back to the chain and the fractured link and kept working. The crossing took 40 minutes that felt like much longer. The frozen lake was solid enough to hold weight. The scouts had tested it, but the ice was old and had the particular quality of northern winter ice that had thawed and refrozen several times. which meant it was dense and load-bearing but vocal about it, groaning under distributed weight in the specific tonal range that made every soldier's spine tighten. Darius led. 8 men behind him in the loose staggered formation that spread weight across the crossing rather than concentrating it. No torches. The fortress walls above the lake had watch rotations that swept the ice with mounted lanterns on 30-minute cycles, and Cale had timed the gap. 17 minutes between sweeps. They were 11 minutes into the crossing. Darius moved with the controlled economy of a man who had operated in night conditions enough times to stop fighting the dark and start using it. His eyes had adjusted fully. The fortress wall resolved from shadow into specific structure as they got closer. The causeway gate on the east face, which would be the obvious point of entry and was therefore heavily guarded. The northern face, which had a lower wall section where the original construction had used a different stone grade. And the waterline foundation, where 3 centuries of freeze-thaw cycles had worked on the mortar in ways that his siege engineer had, before the campaign started, described as significant and exploitable. North face, he said, barely above breath. To Cale, 2 positions back, 40 feet of open ice from the wall base to the first overhang. Cale matched his volume. They'll see us on the sweep. Not if we're already inside before the sweep. 6 minutes. Yes. He felt Cale do the math on that and arrive at the same place he had, and decide, as his soldiers generally decided, that the King Alpha had accounted for the gap, and that asking further questions used up time that was currently the most valuable resource anyone had. They hit the wall base with 4 minutes left on the sweep window. The mortar between the foundation stones had done exactly what the siege engineer had predicted. 3 centuries of freeze-thaw had opened seam lines between the lower courses that were narrow but present. Darius ran his fingers along the base course in the dark, reading it by touch, and found the section where the seam was widest at approximately the height of his knee. He looked at the soldier to his right. Bren, 22 years old and the smallest man in the assault team, which was why Darius had chosen him for this specific function. Bren looked at the seam, looked at Darius. "You're serious," Bren said. "You'll fit." "I'll fit like a boot fits a drain." "Then you'll be a boot." Darius put his shoulder against the adjacent stone and applied pressure. Not force, not yet, just testing the give. Once you're through, you find the inner gate mechanism. There's a secondary entry bar on the north postern. Lift it. And if there's a guard on the postern, handle it quietly. He met the young soldier's eyes in the dark. "You have 3 minutes before the sweep comes back. I need the postern open before it does." Bren looked at the seam one more time, exhaled through his nose. Then he went flat on the ice and started working himself through the gap with the grim, systematic effort of a man who has decided to stop being afraid of the specific thing in front of him and just do it. The rest of them pressed flat against the wall base. The sweep came. The lantern light moved across the ice 40 feet behind them, paused, moved on. 1 minute later, the postern latch clicked. Darius was through the door before it fully opened. The north inner yard was a narrow service corridor between the outer wall and the fortress proper, used for maintenance access and currently unguarded because it wasn't the corridor anyone expected an assault team to be standing in. 2 torches on the far end, a staircase going up on the right, and a passageway going level on the left. He stopped. The mate bond. He had been using it like a compass since the crossing began, keeping the direction of it in his chest the way you kept a fixed star when you were navigating by dark. She was in the fortress. She was close. She was down. He looked at the level passage. "Left," he said. Cale said nothing. They went left. The passage ran under the main fortress body and descended in a long slope that explained the temperature drop. They were moving into the foundation level, the stone around them getting colder and older with every 30 feet. The torches down here were older style, wall-mounted iron brackets, burning lower and leaving more dark between them. He felt her get closer. Felt the bond tighten the way it did when distance decreased. Then he heard her voice. Not raised, not panicked. The specific controlled quality of someone choosing their words with precision. The voice she used when she was in a difficult room and managing it. He stopped at the corner before the last passage. A guard outside a cell door, heavy iron. 1 guard standing, not sitting, which meant active duty rather than routine monitoring. Darius looked at Kale. Kale pointed at himself and two others, made a gesture. 6 seconds later, the guard was down and quiet, and Darius was at the door. Celine. A beat of silence. Then, you took 32 hours off the clock. We had a timeline issue. He was running his hands over the lock mechanism. Old construction, iron pins, not complicated. Are you hurt? No, Darius, I need to tell you something before you get this open, because once you get it open, things are going to move fast, and I need you to hear this while you're still capable of hearing it. He paused with his hands on the lock. The ritual, she said, through the door. The Lycan army. It can't be controlled. Not by Lucien. Not by you. Not by anyone alive. The original binding was a containment measure, not a storage facility. If the ceremony completes, it doesn't give him an army. It releases a catastrophe. He processed this in the specific way he processed critical intelligence under time pressure, so fast, without resistance, slotting it into the operational picture and watching the picture change. How certain? Certain. Does Lucien know? I told him an hour ago. He said he'd consider it. A pause. He's not going to stop. He's too committed to the strategic logic and too certain that the old texts are overstated. Then we stop it. There's one more thing. Her voice dropped. Not quieter, more precise. The voice she used when she was about to say something that was going to cost something. The ritual can also be permanently unmade. Not just interrupted, but destroyed. The binding seal has a counter ceremony. I know how to perform it. I'm the right bloodline, and I know the method. Another pause. But it requires me to be present at the ritual site, under the mountain, which means you'd have to go in before we pull you out. I have to complete the counter ceremony at the exact site where the original binding was performed. If we just stop Lucien and leave, the seal is still compromised. The blood moon will have partially activated it. It would need to be addressed again in 30 years or 20, or whenever the next right alignment hits, and the next time there might not be an Arden healer who knows the counter method. He had the lock picked. He could feel it under his fingers. The pins aligned. One movement, and the door opened. He stood there with his hands on the iron and breathed. Everything in him that was possessive and furious and had been running north for 30 hours wanted to pull this door open, put her behind him, and take her out through the ice and the dark and the garrison, and not stop until they were back inside Iron Fang territory, and she was somewhere with walls he controlled on all 4 sides. Everything in him that had been listening to her for 14 months and understood, specifically and not abstractly, what she was, understood that she was telling him what needed to happen and had already decided she was going to do it. He opened the door. She was on her feet, chains on her wrists, a fracture in one link that had been worked almost through by hand. He looked at that for 1 second and felt something move through his chest that he didn't have a word for. There was a cut above her left eyebrow from the ambush, 3 days old and healing, and she was thinner than she should have been, and her hands were marked with fresh abrasions from the chainwork. She looked at him with those green eyes and the gold ring at their center, and didn't say anything for a moment. He stepped forward and put his hands on her face. She exhaled. The chains, she said. He broke them. The fractured link gave in one pull, and he worked the rest with his hands, and she rotated her wrists and hissed at the circulation returning, and he looked at her wrists in the torchlight, and something tightened in his jaw. Tell me the counter ceremony, he said. Everything. We need to get to the chamber under the North Mountain face. There's an access tunnel from the fortress basement. Lucien had it excavated last year in preparation for the ritual. If the Blood Moon ceremony is already set up at the site, I can use the setup against the ritual. The components are the same. The intention is what changes the outcome. How long does it take? 15 minutes at the site once I begin. She looked at him steadily. The garrison will be between us and that access tunnel. Lucien will be at the ritual site by the time the moon alignment hits, which is 4 hours, Kale said from the passage behind them. She glanced at Kale, back to Darius. You came with 8 soldiers, she said, 9 counting me. Against how many between here and the chamber? He looked at her for a moment. The cold light from the passage torches made the angles of her face sharp, and her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was running a calculation and already approaching the answer she didn't want. Enough, he said. That's not a number. It's enough. He moved toward the passage. You stay behind me. Darius, behind me. Not beside me. Not in front of me. behind me." He looked back at her over his shoulder, and something in his face had the specific quality of a man who has run the full range of argument in his own head and arrived at an answer that isn't negotiable. "You tell me every turn you need. I get you to the chamber. After that, you do what you need to do, and I hold everything else back. That's the division." She was quiet for 2 seconds. "Okay," she said. He turned back toward the passage. The fortress was waking up around them. Somewhere in the upper levels, an alarm had found its feet. Not the full mobilization bell yet, but the early warning sound of guards who had found something wrong and were escalating it. The assault team moved through the basement passage at pace, Darius at the front and Celine directly behind him, and Kale running the rear, and the fortress walls were giving him the specific information that Old Stone gives when it knows violence is coming. Every sound magnified, every shadow holding the possibility of contact. They hit the first interior guard rotation at the basement junction. 6 guards, armed and positioned at the cross-passage intersection that controlled access to the lower fortress. They had 30 seconds of warning from the sound of boots. Enough to form up, not enough to reinforce. Darius hit them in wolf form. The fight was brief and brutal and left all 6 guards alive but non-functional, which was the specific outcome he was aiming for. Not because he had scruples about the alternative, but because unconscious guards didn't raise alarms, and dead ones did. He shifted back without breaking stride, and Celine was already moving through the junction before the last man hit the floor. "Left passage," she said. "The access tunnel Lucien excavated. It should open from a false panel in the south foundation wall." He described it as 60 feet down the left passage. He went left. The false panel was exactly where she said it was. Newer stonework, a slightly different color in the torchlight, a seam that ran in a rectangle rather than the natural lines of old construction. He found the release mechanism by feel, a pressure point in the lower right corner, and the panel swung inward on new iron hinges. Cold air came through, older than the fortress cold, deep earth cold. The tunnel was narrow and went down at a consistent angle, shored with heavy timber on the sides and lit by a string of oil lamps that had been recently placed and recently lit. Someone was already down there. He could hear it, far below, the movement of several people, the specific acoustic of a large underground space amplifying sound and sending it back up the tunnel in broken pieces. Voices. The preparation sound of a ceremony that hadn't started but was close. He looked back at Celine. She was looking at the tunnel with an expression he had learned to read. Not fear, not exactly. The thing that came before decision. The moment where a person looks at what they're about to do and takes its full measure before committing. She took its measure. "I need to reach the central stone," she said. "It will be a flat altar surface at the chamber's center. That's where the original binding was anchored. That's where the counter ceremony has to happen." "How many people will be in there?" "Lucien, his ritual specialists, probably 4 or 5. Guards at the chamber entrance." She paused. "Darius, he'll fight you. He's not a weak alpha." "I know. I need you to keep him off me for 15 minutes. Not kill him. Not yet. Not before I finish. His death inside the chamber could destabilize the—" "I'll manage him," Darius said. The flatness was back in his voice, the very specific quality of a man operating at the outermost edge of his control and holding it through intention rather than ease. "You get to the stone. You do what you need to do. I keep everything else off you." She looked at him. "After," she said. "After," he said. It wasn't a complete sentence for either of them. It didn't need to be. He turned to his team. "Kale, you and 3 others take the entrance guards, fast and permanent. The other 4 hold the tunnel. No one comes through behind us." He met each face in the lamplight. "Once we're in the chamber, the objective is the Luna reaching that stone. Everything else is secondary. Is that clear?" Every face showed him that it was clear. He looked at Celine one more time, brief, direct. Then he went down the tunnel, and behind him, somewhere in the upper fortress, the full mobilization bell began to ring. The garrison was coming. They had minutes, not many, before the tunnel became the only choke point between everything above and everything below. And once that choke closed, there was no path back out. The point of no return was not at the chamber door. It had been at the border marker 3 days ago when he watched his war commander's face show the specific calculation of a man running out of options. It had been when he felt her through the bond, alive, intact, waiting. It had been 14 months ago in a corridor when he stepped in front of a healer from a rival bloodline who had been in his court for 3 weeks and said, "You know what this is." And she looked at him with gold-ringed eyes and said, "I've known for 2 months." He hit the bottom of the tunnel at a run, and the chamber opened in front of him, and Lucian Draven turned from the central stone with those flat silver eyes and a sword already in his hand, and the blood moon light was coming in through a crack in the mountain ceiling and hitting the altar in a column of pale, exact illumination. And 15 minutes was everything. And the only thought in Darius Vane's chest as he crossed into the chamber was very simple: hold the line. The chamber was older than the fortress above it. Darius understood this the moment his boots hit the bottom of the tunnel and the space opened around him. A cavern that had not been carved, but had always existed, shaped by the mountain's own geological argument with itself over centuries, with walls that curved inward at the ceiling like cupped hands, and a floor that had been worn smooth not by tools, but by time. The Draven excavation had merely connected the fortress to something that was already here. The oil lamps they had strung along the tunnel continued in a loose ring around the chamber's perimeter, and the light they gave was thin and directional, leaving the upper third of the space in a dark that the blood moon's column of light did not fully penetrate. The central stone was exactly what Celine had described: a flat altar surface, waist-height, gray-black rock with a grain that ran in horizontal lines like frozen water. The blood moon column came through a natural fissure in the ceiling directly above it, and the light hitting the stone had a quality that Darius had no clean category for. Not warm, not cold, but present in a way that made the animal part of him register it and pull back. Lucien stood at the near edge of the altar with his sword drawn and his ritual specialists arranged behind him. 5 figures in dark clothing, not fighters, with the posture of people who had been interrupted mid-preparation and were deciding how to process the interruption. 4 guards at the far entrance. Kale was already moving on the tunnel entrance behind Darius. Darius crossed the chamber floor at pace. Lucien moved to meet him, and the first exchange was fast and brutal, and told Darius exactly what he needed to know about what he was dealing with. Lucien was trained, genuinely trained, not a political swordsman, but someone who had spent real time with real instruction, and he had reach and the specific advantage of a man who had chosen his ground. The first clash rang off the cavern walls and came back doubled. "You made better time than I expected," Lucien said. His voice stayed even. The sword arm didn't. "Your garrison is slow." The garrison was a delay, not a defense. He came back on the second exchange with a combination that pushed Darius 3 steps left and nearly cost him his footing on the uneven stone. "I want you to understand something, Darius. I don't want to kill you. This was never about you. You took my Luna. I took a bloodline I needed." He pressed the attack, fast, controlled, using the altar stone's position to force Darius away from the center of the chamber. "She told you about the army. She told you it can't be controlled. I've read different conclusions." She read the source texts. She read one interpretation. He feinted high and cut low, and Darius caught it on his forearm. Not the blade, the flat, but the force of it was enough to leave the arm hot and half-functional for 30 seconds. "The Arden copies your mate references are incomplete. The Draven Archive has 3 additional volumes from the same author that describe a containment method, a command structure. You believe that. I've spent 4 years believing it." Something moved in his flat silver eyes. Not doubt, exactly, but the place where certainty and doubt share a wall. "She's more persuasive than I anticipated. I'll grant her that." Darius looked at him for a half-second between exchanges and read what was there. A man who had built a plan on a foundation and was now standing on it while someone described the cracks, and who was too committed to the architecture to walk away from it even as the floor moved under him. This was going to be a problem, because a man who knew he might be wrong and kept going anyway was harder to reason with than a man who was simply wrong. There was a specific kind of dangerous that lived in the gap between doubt and commitment, where a person had invested too much to stop and not enough certainty to feel clean about continuing, and that gap made them accelerate rather than hesitate. On the far side of the chamber, Celine was moving. Darius had clocked it in his peripheral vision. She had come through the chamber entrance behind him while Kale engaged the entry guards, had immediately angled toward the central altar rather than toward any available cover, and was now navigating the space between Lucian's ritual specialists with the specific calm of a woman who understood that hesitation was more dangerous than motion. One of the specialists moved to intercept her. Darius put himself between them without breaking his engagement with Lucian, a diagonal step that opened a new attack angle while cutting the specialist off, forcing the man to recalculate rather than reach her. The specialist was not a fighter. He stopped. "Get to the stone," Darius said without looking at her. He heard her footsteps change cadence. Lucian heard them too. His eyes cut to her position and something in his face sharpened. "Stop her," he said, to his specialists. "If they touch her," Darius said, cutting off Lucian's next strike with a force that drove the man's sword arm wide. "I stopped managing this carefully." Lucian reset his stance. His breathing had changed, still controlled, but working harder. "You can't hold me and protect her simultaneously." "I'm managing. For now." He came forward again, and this time the combination was different. Less tactical, more physical, the shift a trained fighter makes when he's decided to end the exchange through attrition rather than technique. He was bigger than he looked. The lean frame had real power behind it, and he was using the chamber's uneven floor with the familiarity of a man who had been in this space before. "Magnus told me you would come in exactly this way. Fast, small group, direct assault. He said you'd never wait 300 soldiers out." The name landed in the chamber like something thrown. Darius's next movement was a fraction late. Just a fraction. Lucian caught the inside of his guard, and the sword's edge opened a line across Darius's left side, below the ribs. Not deep, but real. He stepped back and felt the specific burn of it, and kept his eyes on Lucian. "Magnus has been communicating," Darius said. Flat. "He has been communicating for 2 years. Lucian's voice had a new quality. Not gloating, something more complicated than that. The tone of a man delivering information he knows will hurt and is watching to see where it lands. "He told me about the Luna's bloodline 3 years ago. He was the one who identified the Arden lineage's significance and brought it to my attention. The gathering, the skull, the layout, the timing, the security positioning, all of it came from him." Darius already knew this. He had already put Magnus in chains for this. But hearing it said aloud in this chamber, in this specific context, "He told me about your Luna 3 years ago," put a shape on it that the abstract knowledge hadn't fully had. 3 years. While Magnus sat at his table and stood at his shoulder and called him my king, with the specific tone of a man whose loyalty was his primary credential. 3 years of dinners and councils and campaigns, and the easy intimacy of a war commander who knew where every body was buried because he had helped bury half of them. The wound in his side was bleeding steadily. Not critically, he had run campaigns with worse, but the blood loss over time was a variable. "He also told me something else," Lucian said. He had pulled back slightly, creating distance, which was not the behavior of a man pressing an advantage, but of a man buying time. Darius cataloged this. "Something about the counter-ceremony your mate is attempting right now." The quality of the silence that followed was different from the previous silences. Darius heard it before he understood why. Then he understood why. He turned. Celine was at the central stone, both hands on its surface, her eyes closed, her lips moving in the silent, specific rhythm of someone working through a precise sequence. The blood moon light fell on her directly, and gave her face a quality that made the specialists behind her take a step back. She was already deep into it. 15 minutes, she had said. He had no sense of how long it had been. The chamber's time was its own. Behind her, at the chamber's secondary entrance, the one that connected to the northern mountain passage rather than the fortress tunnel, 3 figures were coming through. Not garrison soldiers. Wrong clothing, wrong posture, wrong purpose. They moved like specialists, like the kind of people you brought when the task required precision rather than numbers. And one of them was carrying something that Darius had not seen outside of Draven military intelligence reports. A silver compound deployment device, the same type used at the peace gathering. The flask and mechanism set up that aerosolized the compound and delivered it in a radius rather than a point. Lucian had a secondary team. He had never planned to win the chamber fight with a sword. Darius shifted. Fully. No managed half transition, no controlled partial. He hit the wolf completely in the space between one step and the next, and covered the distance to the secondary entrance in the kind of burst that erased the math of the room. He was on the first specialist before the silver device could be raised, and the second before the first hit the floor, and he took a blade across the shoulder from the third that he registered as information rather than impediment. He held the third one by the throat against the chamber wall. The silver device was on the floor. He had put his foot through it when he came down from the second contact, and it had broken and discharged its contents in a small localized cloud that had touched the back of his right arm and the right side of his neck and was burning the way silver always burned, specific and deep, like heat applied from the inside out. He was still shifted. The burn wasn't enough to force the change back, not yet, but it was working on his edges. He looked at the man in his hand. The man was alive, eyes wide, not fighting. Darius dropped him, turned, and shifted back. The chamber had gone to a specific stillness. Kale and two of the assault team had contained the ritual specialists on the far side. Lucien was standing near the altar with his sword still drawn, but his angle changed. He was between Darius and the altar now, between Darius and Celine, and his posture had shifted from combat engagement to something more deliberate. Celine had not stopped. Whatever she was doing at the stone, she had not broken concentration for the fight or the silver discharge or anything else in the chamber. This was either remarkable discipline or something Darius didn't have a category for. Lucien looked at him across the chamber with those flat silver eyes. "The silver compound in the air will hit her," Lucien said. "The discharge radius, you can see where the cloud moved. She's at the edge of it." He paused. "Silver affects Arden bloodline carriers differently than standard wolves. Her grandmother's research documented this. Exposure during the ceremony could corrupt the counter-ritual, complete it in the wrong frequency." Another pause. "Seal the army into a damaged containment rather than destroying the mechanism. Which means the next alignment—" "I know what it means," Darius said. He was already reading the air. The silver cloud had dispersed, but not fully. The chamber's limited air movement was keeping it present near the floor and the altar area. He could see it in the way the lamp flames behaved. He could feel the edge of it on his own skin at the distance he was standing. She was inside it. He looked at her at the stone and understood with the specific clarity of a man who has run out of intermediate options that there were now two possible outcomes in this chamber, and both of them required him to do something he had not planned to do. He could pull her off the stone, stop the ceremony before the silver exposure deepened, lose the counter-ritual, leave the army seal damaged, deal with the consequences later and in a context where he had more resources and preparation. Or he could let her finish, let her stay in the silver air for however many minutes remained. Trust that she had known what she was doing when she put her hands on the stone, and hold everything in this chamber away from her for the duration, and deal with what the silver did to her afterward. His side was bleeding. His shoulder was bleeding. His right arm and neck were burning from direct compound exposure. The garrison above them was moving. Kale had reported sounds in the tunnel 2 minutes ago, and the 9 soldiers he had brought into this mountain were handling a fight that was beyond 9 soldiers. He looked at Celine. He looked at the way she stood at the stone. Both hands flat, weight slightly forward, that specific quality of absorption that she had when she was doing the thing she was built for. Her face in the blood moonlight had the lines of someone carrying enormous weight with complete intention. She had known about the silver risk. She had known what coming to this chamber meant. She had made her calculation before they came down the tunnel, before she put her hands on the stone, before she told him 15 minutes with the steady eyes of a woman who had already priced what she was spending. She hadn't told him the silver risk because she had known he would stop her. He turned to Lucien. "You're going to step away from the altar." I don't think you're going to step away from the altar," he said again, "or I'm going to move you, and I want you to look at me right now and decide whether you want to understand the difference between those two options." Lucien looked at him, read whatever was in his face, took a full 3 seconds, stepped aside. Darius crossed the chamber and stood at Celine's back, close enough that his body blocked the line between her and Lucien, close enough that the silver air was his now too, and put nothing in his hands because his hands weren't the point. The point was the line between her and everything else. The burn across his neck and right arm deepened as he stood in the silver residue. He felt it working through the layers, skin, then the tissue underneath, then the specific resonance it had with wolf blood that regular wounds didn't have. It was pulling at his shift, destabilizing the boundary between forms in a way that would become serious if he stayed in it long enough. He stood in it. Behind him, at the tunnel entrance, the garrison sounds had gotten louder. Kale appeared at the edge of his vision. My king, they're at the top of the tunnel. 2 minutes. Hold it. With 6 soldiers, hold it for 10 minutes. Then it doesn't matter. Kale looked at him with the face of a man running math that doesn't balance, and arriving at the conclusion that the math isn't the point. Yes, my king. He went back to the tunnel. Lucien had not moved from where he had stepped. He was watching Celine at the stone with an expression that had moved in the last several minutes through several stages and arrived somewhere that Darius hadn't expected, something that was close to grief. The flat silver eyes had a specific quality in them that was not the calculation Darius had read there before. He was watching a plan die. Not just a plan, 4 years of architecture, of intelligence gathering, of a strategic calculation built on a foundation he had believed in completely and was now watching come apart at the hands of the healer he had kidnapped to complete it. She was right, Lucien said. Quiet, more to himself than to the room. Darius said nothing. About the texts, about the army. I knew she was right when she told me. His jaw worked. I've known for 6 months that the additional volumes I referenced were transcribed incorrectly. The command structure my archive described. It was a mistranslation of a containment warning. He exhaled, long and slow. I spent 3 years building a weapon. I spent 6 months knowing it was going to kill everyone and still running the calendar because I had already given everything to get here. You could have stopped it. Could I? He looked at Darius with something that was very close to direct honesty, the kind that only shows up when a man has run out of face to save. How many decisions have you made, knowing the cost was wrong, because the alternative was admitting the first decision had been a mistake? How many campaigns have you run past the point where a rational man would stop, because stopping meant accounting for everything you'd already spent? The silver burn was deep in Darius's shoulder now. He kept his eyes forward. All of them, Darius said. The answer is all of them. And the difference between us is that I found someone who made me stop counting the cost and start counting the outcome. Lucien was quiet for a long moment. I know, he said. That's what I wanted to take from you. The stone beneath Celine's hands began to produce a sound, not loud, below the level of sound almost, more felt than heard, a vibration in the rock floor that moved up through the soles of the feet and into the legs and chest. The blood moon column of light above the altar changed quality. Not brighter, more resolved, like a blurred image coming into focus. Darius felt it in his chest. Not the mate bond. Something older. The deep animal register that Wolfblood carried from the original lineage, the part that remembered when the things under mountains were real. Something below them was moving. Not waking, not yet, not fully, but registering the ceremony above it the way a sleeper registers a sound in the room, shifting between states, the dormancy beginning to thin. Celine's hands pressed harder into the stone, and then the silver compound hit her system fully. He knew it because her knees buckled. 1 second she was planted and focused and completely in the work, and the next her left knee dropped toward the stone floor, and her upper body sagged forward, and her hands scrambled to maintain contact with the altar surface. The sound she made was not a scream, it was the breath of someone absorbing something enormous through pure will, the specific exhale of a person who is not going to let their body stop them. He moved before he chose to move. One hand on her hip, one on her shoulder, bearing the weight her legs were failing to bear, keeping her upright, and her hands in contact with the stone. The silver in the air was full against him now. His right side had gone from burning to something past burning, and he felt the shift boundary in him flickering, the wolf trying to surface in response to the chemical attack, and the human half holding it back through the specific discipline of a man who understood that shifting now would cost him the grip he had on her. He held the form, held her upright, felt the stone's vibration through her body and into his hands. Don't stop, he said. Into her hair, very quiet. Whatever you need from me, use it. She exhaled through her teeth, her hands steadied on the stone, and in the tunnel above the chamber, 6 Iron Fang soldiers were holding a door against a garrison of 300, and Magnus Hale was in chains in a forest with everything he had sold still sitting in his chest, and the blood moon was at its peak above the mountain, and Lucienne Draven stood at the edge of the chamber watching the thing he'd built for 4 years perform its exact opposite function. The vibration in the floor shifted, not increasing, changing direction. The way a tide changes. The same force turned. 7 minutes. Darius held her weight and stood in the silver air and did not move. And the thing below the mountain, which had been sleeping for 3 centuries and had begun to register the ceremony above it, felt the frequency change and went still. Not gone. Not gone yet. But listening to something different now. 8 minutes. The garrison broke through the tunnel. The 6 soldiers at the top went down in under a minute. Darius heard it, registered the tactical situation with the part of his mind that never stopped, understood that the tunnel was now open and the garrison would be in the chamber in under 3 minutes, and looked at the math of what remained. 3 minutes. 7 soldiers left functional, Lucienne standing to the side. 15 specialists and garrison troops incoming from above. He had been in worse math. Not much worse. His right arm had stopped responding cleanly. The silver exposure had gotten into the joint, and the nerve signals were arriving delayed and partial. He adjusted the grip on Celine's hip to compensate. She was still at the stone, still working, her breathing hard and ragged and completely intentional. He looked at Lucienne. Lucienne looked at him. "Call them off," Darius said. The flat silver eyes held his. "They won't stop for my order at this point," Lucienne said. "The garrison commander has standing orders for hostile entry. I'd have to physically countermand him." "Then go physically countermand him." A pause that lasted exactly as long as a man needed to decide whether he was done with one version of himself. Lucian turned and walked to the tunnel entrance. Darius heard his voice in the tunnel. Sharp, precise, carrying the weight of command. The garrison sounds changed. Did not stop entirely, but changed. 9 minutes. Celine's hands were shaking on the stone. The shaking was not weakness, it was the specific tremor of a person pushing through a system that was trying to shut down, holding the connection through will because the body was no longer fully cooperating. "Celine." "I hear you." Her voice was compressed. "Working. 2 minutes. I need 2 minutes." "You have them." He held her and faced the room and held the line with a right arm that barely worked, and a silver burn that had gotten into his ribs, and a wound in his side that had been bleeding for 23 minutes, and he thought about nothing except the vibration in the stone beneath her hands, and the specific quality of her breathing, and the 2 minutes she had asked him for. 2 minutes was nothing. 2 minutes was everything. The floor shifted. Not an earthquake. A cessation. The vibration that had been rising through the rock from whatever lived 3 centuries deep below them simply stopped. Not cut off. Not suppressed. Resolved. The specific quality of a sound that has reached its natural end rather than being interrupted. Silence moved through the chamber from the floor upward. The blood moon column of light above the altar dimmed. Not went out. Dimmed to the quality of ordinary light, the specific ordinary quality of moonlight through rock, stripped of whatever it had been doing when it hit the altar surface at the correct alignment. Celine's hands came off the stone. She would have gone straight down if he hadn't been holding her. He caught her full weight, and she was heavier than expected. Not physically, but in the specific way of a person whose systems have given everything and are asking for the debt to be recognized. He turned her, got his arms underneath her properly, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in the specific ragged way of someone who has been holding their breath for 15 minutes and is now accounting for all of it. "Done," she said, into his shoulder, barely above breath. He looked at the stone. It looked like a rock. An old rock in a cave. Nothing about it said anything about what it had been 6 minutes ago. Nothing in the chamber floor vibrated. Nothing in the air below them moved. He looked at the ceiling fissure. The blood moon had passed its peak while they were down here. The light had shifted to the pale silver of late lunar light, ordinary and without resonance. "It's done," she said again. Steadier now. "The binding seal is destroyed. The mechanism is gone. The army's dormancy was biological, not magical. Without the seal, it degrades naturally. In 20 years, there will be nothing down there but bones." 20 years. Nobody has to manage it. Nobody can use it. It's just done. She pulled back enough to look at his face. Her eyes found his right arm immediately, then his side, then his neck. Her healer's inventory. You held the silver exposure for 11 minutes, approximately. Your shift boundary is compromised. That's going to take later. Darius? Later, he said. Not harsh, just settled. The specific voice of a man who has finished the most important thing and is willing to deal with the costs from a position of having finished it. Right now I need to know you can walk. She tested her legs against the floor, steadied, nodded. He looked up. At the tunnel entrance, Lucian stood with his garrison commander, a heavy-built man who is currently recalibrating in the specific way of a soldier whose orders have been countermanded mid-execution and who is trying to determine what the new landscape requires. Lucian looked at Darius across the chamber. It's done, Darius said. Lucian's gaze moved to the stone, stayed there for a long moment, then, yes. The war is done with it. The army, the ritual, the strategic calculation you spent 4 years building, done. He kept his voice even. What happens next is a conversation between kingdoms, not in a mountain under a blood moon. I suppose it is. Lucian looked at him with the flat silver eyes, and underneath the flatness, there was something that was either exhaustion or recognition. You know I can't simply release you. My garrison is in this mountain. The political consequence of letting the Iron Fang King walk out. The political consequence, Selene said from Darius's shoulder, of keeping him here is that 300 garrison soldiers learn what it means when an Iron Fang King is cornered in an enclosed space with nothing left to lose. She paused. I've seen what that looks like. You don't want to. Lucian looked at her. For a long time. No, he said finally. I don't. The garrison commander said nothing. He was a man reading the room and arriving at the conclusion that the room had changed in ways his standing orders didn't cover. My injured soldiers, Darius said. All of them, including the ones at the tunnel top. They walk out with us. Agreed. My war commander, currently in chains in your eastern forest. He remains in my custody. Something moved in Lucian's eyes. Magnus was a useful intelligence asset. His exposure changes my strategic position significantly. That's your problem, Darius said. He's my problem to deal with. Lucian held his gaze for a moment. Yes, he is. The silence in the chamber had the quality of an aftermath. Not resolution, not quite, but the specific stillness that follows the largest event in a room and precedes the accounting. The oil lamps burned low around the perimeter. The blood moon had moved past the fissure entirely. The stone at the chamber's center was cold and old and unremarkable. Darius looked at it one more time. He thought about Magnus, about 22 years, about the specific weight of learning that a man you trusted with the internal architecture of everything you'd built had been selling the blueprints to someone else, and that the thing you'd never expected to be your vulnerability, the mate bond, the one person capable of calming the monster inside him, the one decision in his adult life that had not been made by strategy, had been the thing they'd used as the lever. He thought about that. He thought about the fact that Selene had walked into a frozen mountain with compromised chain links and silver exposure and a counter ceremony she'd only half confirmed would work, and had done it anyway because the alternative was leaving the problem for someone else to solve in 20 or 30 years. And she was not built for leaving problems for other people to solve. He thought about what it meant that she was the only reason he hadn't torn Lucian Draven apart in this chamber when he had 3 clear opportunities to do it. Not fear, not strategy. The specific restraint of a man who had learned over 14 months that the things worth holding were worth the cost of managing what you carried to hold them. It was not a comfortable thought. It was not supposed to be. Let's go, he said. Selene took his arm, his left arm, the one that worked, and they walked toward the tunnel. Behind them, the chamber held its silence, and the stone held nothing, and 300 feet below the floor, the oldest army in the Northern Territories breathed its last living breath in the dark, and began, without drama or ceremony, to become the past. The tunnel back up was longer than the tunnel going down. Not physically. The distance was the same 40 degrees of incline, the same timber-shored walls, the same string of oil lamps burning low on their last reserves. But the body accounts for everything it has spent, and the body does this accounting on its own schedule. and by the time Darius had Celine on his left arm, and Kale and 5 remaining soldiers in formation around them, and was moving upward through the mountain's gut, the accounting had begun. His right arm had a range of motion that stopped at the shoulder. The silver compound had gotten deep into the joint, not irreversible. Wolf blood healed things that would end a human permanently. But for the duration of the next several hours, it was structural decoration rather than functional limb. He had shifted his sword to his left hand before they entered the tunnel and had said nothing about the reason. The wound in his side had slowed. Not closed. Slowed. The kind of bleeding that became a problem through accumulation rather than speed, that felt manageable until suddenly it didn't. He put these facts in the operational column and kept moving. Celine had her footing back fully. The silver exposure had taken something from her that he could feel through the bond, a depletion, a thinned quality, like cloth that has been washed too many times. But she was upright, and her hand on his arm was grip rather than support, and her eyes, when she looked at him, had the specific alertness of a healer running her own internal assessment. "Your shift boundary," she said quietly as they climbed. "Stable." "That's not what I asked." "Stable enough." She looked at the right arm, the way it hung, the angle of his shoulder. "When we're clear of the garrison," she said, "you tell me before you try to fight anything." "That's not how this works." "I'm telling you how it works now." Her voice was low and hard and completely without negotiation. "You have compromised silver exposure in your primary arm, an open wound that's been bleeding for 30 minutes, and a shift boundary that will destabilize under full combat stress. You tell me before you fight anything, or I walk on your right side and become a problem you have to manage around." He looked at her sidelong. "You would do that." "Try me." He looked forward again. The tunnel was brightening, the fortress basement light coming down from the top of the incline, stronger than the oil lamps, which meant the garrison had moved through and left the upper entrance open. "If the situation requires it," he said, "you don't have veto." "I'm not asking for veto. I'm asking for 10 seconds of information before you throw yourself at something." A pause. "You gave me 15 minutes at a stone and silver air without trying to pull me off it. Give me 10 seconds. He didn't answer, but he didn't disagree either, which Celine had learned, over 14 months, was a form of yes from a man who was constitutionally incapable of saying the word in a tactical context. They came up through the basement into the fortress proper. The fortress had changed in the time they'd been below it. The garrison mobilization had moved troops through the interior passages in ways that left the central corridors emptied and the outer perimeter heavily concentrated. A standard response pattern to a confirmed internal breach, pulling forces to the walls and entry points, and leaving the interior as a controlled funnel. Darius read it in the first 20 seconds above ground and adjusted the route accordingly. Kale came up beside him. "Eastern exit is compromised. Garrison's got the causeway gate locked and the outer wall watch doubled." "North postern?" "Bren's team is holding it. Barely." Darius looked at the corridor options. His mind ran the geometry of the fortress, the walls, the exits, the garrison positioning, with the specific efficiency of a man who had been doing this since adolescence and had long ago stopped experiencing it as effort. It was like reading, for him. The environment was text. He absorbed it and understood it and moved within it. The north postern was the exit. It was also 80 meters of corridor through a fortress that currently had 300 garrison soldiers in various states of mobilization. Lucien had given his word. He had countermanded the garrison commander in the chamber. The question was how far that word traveled up 3 flights of stairs and through the command structure of soldiers who had been watching an Iron Fang assault team work through their fortress for the past hour. The answer came around the first corner. 12 garrison soldiers, not in assault formation, but not standing aside either, blocking the corridor in the specific arrangement of men who have received a complicated order and are interpreting it conservatively. Not engage the Iron Fang team, but not let them pass either. Something in between that was going to require resolution. Darius stopped. The garrison sergeant at the front of the 12 was a broad man in his 40s who had the face of someone who had been a soldier long enough to recognize when the situation had outgrown his orders and was currently deciding how to handle the gap. King Alpha. The title delivered with the specific neutrality of a man who is acknowledging rank without committing to a position. Lord Draven's order was to permit your passage. Then permit it. The order covered the tunnel exit. My authority for the corridor. Your lord gave the order, Darius said. The corridor is between the tunnel and the exit. If your lord's order requires a map to implement, that's a problem with the order, not a reason to stand in my way. The sergeant's jaw moved. He was running a calculation that a man in his position ran when the chain of command had delivered contradictory results. Follow the standing orders that his training was built on, or follow the specific recent order from the man at the top of the chain. One was safe, the other was right. Those two things were not always the same thing, and every soldier learned this eventually. Let them through, Sergeant, Lucian's voice from the corridor behind the garrison squad. He had come up from the mountains separately, through a route Darius didn't know and hadn't expected, and was standing now at the rear of his own men with his sword sheathed and his hands visible and an expression that had moved in the 40 minutes since the chamber further into something Darius couldn't fully categorize. Not remorse, something more functional than remorse. The specific face of a man who has decided what comes next and is implementing it. The garrison squad moved aside. Darius walked through without acknowledging the sergeant. His team moved with him. Celine stayed on his left. Lucian fell into pace beside them. Darius looked at him. You didn't have to come up, Darius said. No, Lucian agreed. I didn't. They walked the corridor in a silence that had the weight of two men who had fought each other 20 minutes ago and were now occupying the same space with the careful attention of people who understand that the situation has changed but haven't fully mapped the new shape. Magnus Hale, Lucian said. He's in chains in the eastern forest. Yes. He'll tell you everything. The depth of the arrangement, the timelines, the specific information he passed. He's been running for 3 years and he knows the exposure is complete. Men in that position tell everything. He paused. I want you to know that his recruitment came from my initiative, not from within your house. He was a man with a grievance about Iron Fang's succession that predated your reign. I found the grievance. I used it. You're telling me this. I'm telling you this because you're going to find it out anyway, and because I'd rather you have the accurate version than Magnus's version. He glanced at Celine. And because your mate told me an hour ago that the only path forward was a negotiated settlement rather than two kingdoms bleeding each other for the next decade. She was right about the army. She's probably right about this too. Celine didn't look at him. But Darius felt, through the bond, something that was not quite satisfaction and not quite vindication. The specific feeling of a person who has been saying the same thing for a long time and has just heard it come back to them from an unexpected direction. She usually is, Darius said. They reached the north postern. Bren was there. Alive. Which was the first thing Darius checked, the young soldier's face cut across the cheek and his left hand wrapped in cloth that had gone dark, but his eyes functional and his back against the wall in the posture of someone who had held a position through attrition and was very ready to be relieved of it. My king, his voice was rough. Garrison hit the postern twice. We held. I see that. Darius looked at the hand. Can you move? Can move. Can't fight. You don't have to fight. He looked at Kale. Full count. Everyone who can walk walks out. 7 functional, Kale said. 2 need carrying. Carry them. The postern opened onto the narrow ice shelf between the fortress outer wall and the lake edge, and the dawn was coming up over the eastern ridge in the flat gray way of northern autumn dawns, without color or warmth, but with a quality of light that was simply better than the dark had been. The lake ice was still solid. The crossing route was clear. Darius stood at the postern and turned back. Lucien stood in the corridor inside. They looked at each other across the threshold. Negotiated settlement, Darius said. Terms to be agreed through formal channels, not through military operations or intelligence assets. Agreed. Magnus Hale remains in Iron Fang custody. I have no objection. And if I find any other Draven assets inside my council, you won't find them through me, Lucian said. That arrangement is closed. He paused. The Eastern Kingdoms I mentioned, the build-up. That's real, whatever you think of the solution I chose. You'll want to look at it. Darius held his gaze, reading it. The flat silver eyes had a different quality now. Not open, a man like Lucian didn't go open, but present in a way they hadn't been in the chamber, stripped of a layer. I'll look at it, Darius said. He stepped through the postern. The team crossed the lake in the early gray dawn, and the ice held, and nobody spoke. They found Magnus in the eastern forest exactly where Darius had left him, 2 soldiers guarding. Magnus seated against a pine with his hands and feet chained, and his face showing the specific quality of a man who has spent 8 hours with nothing to do except sit inside what he has done. He looked up when the column came through the tree line, and his face did something complicated when he saw Selene walking, alive, intact, standing under her own power. The thing his face did was not the thing a man's face did when his plan had simply failed. It was the thing a face did when the thing it had traded everything for. Certainty, insurance, the private strategic calculation built on the assumption that the outcome would look different from this, turned out to have been wrong in ways that couldn't be argued with. Darius stopped in front of him. Magnus looked up at him without speaking. 22 years, Darius let himself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as it took to breathe in and out twice. The table in the war room, the Eastern Campaign, the Northern Campaign, the 3 winters where the kingdom held against pressure that should have broken it, and Magnus at his shoulder through every single one with the steady, practical voice of a man whose loyalty was structural. And underneath all of it, for 3 years, the other conversation. The one happening in a different room with different stakes and a different lord. Men hid things for different reasons: fear, greed, ideological conviction, grievance. Lucian had mentioned a grievance about Iron Fang's succession that predated Darius's reign. Something about Magnus and the Old King, some arrangement or promise or wound that had been sitting unaddressed since before Darius was old enough to hold a crown. He didn't ask about it. Not here, not now. The why would come out in formal process, in the controlled setting where it could be documented and assessed and dealt with through the mechanisms that kingdoms use to deal with these things. He was not going to have the conversation on a forest floor with 8 wounded soldiers around him. But he looked at Magnus, and he let the man see him looking, and what passed between them in that 30 seconds of silence was not forgiveness and was not the end of the thing, but was a kind of honest accounting. 2 men who had known each other across 22 years and a betrayal, taking the full measure of what was left. "Get him up," Darius said to the guards. "He walks back to the border under escort." "My king," Magnus started. "Don't. Flat. Final. Not here. Not in front of my soldiers." He held the amber gaze steady. "When we're back in the kingdom, in a room with walls and a proper process, you tell everything, every contact, every message, every piece of information you passed, every arrangement you made, everything. That's the one thing I'm giving you. A proper process instead of a forest judgment." He paused. "Don't make me regret the generosity." Magnus's jaw set. His eyes moved to Selene. Selene looked at him with an expression that was not kind and was not cruel. The specific expression of a healer who has assessed damage and is deciding whether it's worth treating. She said nothing. Magnus looked back at the ground. "Get him up," Darius said again, and walked past. The border crossing back into Iron Fang territory took 3 hours on horseback, riding hard and managing the wounded across terrain that was not designed for mercy. By the time the Iron Fang garrison markers appeared in the tree line, 4 of the 9 assault team members were on shared horses, and 2 were being supported in the saddle by the soldiers next to them. Darius rode the last 2 hours without his right arm, had stopped pretending it was functional. The silver burn had settled into a deep ache that ran from the shoulder socket down through the elbow and made the fingers intermittently respond to commands that the brain issued clearly and the nerves relayed poorly. Selene rode beside him and said nothing about the arm. She had looked at it at the midpoint rest stop, run her hands along the shoulder and elbow with the clinical attention of a professional assessment, and had said 3 days with the compound treatment and full mobility returns. 1 week, and the silver traces are fully metabolized. You'll shift without complications. And then had given him a look that communicated everything the assessment had left out. The version of the prognosis that a healer gave to a patient rather than a mate, which was that he had stood in a silver compound cloud for 11 minutes holding another person upright, and the cost was manageable only because wolf blood was genuinely extraordinary. He had looked back at her and said nothing. She had looked forward and said nothing. That had been its own kind of conversation. The garrison at the Iron Fang border marker came out to meet them. 20 soldiers, the standing border rotation, who had been receiving relay messages about the Draven situation for 3 days and had the particular tight-wound readiness of people waiting for information they knew was critical and hadn't arrived yet. The garrison captain was a woman named Hessa, 30 years old, competent and direct, and currently working very hard to keep her face neutral as she read the state of the team coming through the tree line. "My king!" Her eyes moved to Celine, back to Darius. "Luna Arden." The relief in her face was professional and real, and lasted exactly 1 second before she put it away. Situation report. Draven operation neutralized. Luna is recovered. 9 assault team members, 7 walking wounded, 2 requiring medical support immediately. He brought his horse to a stop. "Send a relay to the capital. I want the War Council, the remaining War Council, assembled by the time we arrive, and I want a separate relay to the northern garrisons. The Draven Eastern Army concern that Magnus Hale was managing intelligence on. I want everything in that file on my desk." "Understood." She paused. "My king, there's been a development in the capital." He looked at her. "During the king's absence," Hessa said carefully, with the voice of a soldier delivering information she has been turning over since she received it, "2 council members have been communicating with each other about the succession question. Specifically about the vacancy that would exist in the war commander position if Magnus Hale was—" She stopped. "There are letters. Intercepted by your intelligence, Captain." Kale, riding behind Darius, said nothing, but Darius heard the quality of his silence. "Names," Darius said. Hessa told him. He sat on the horse at the border marker and felt the specific quality of what it was to be an Alpha King coming back from a 3-day crisis with a wounded arm and an open side wound and a war commander in chains, and learning that the crisis had grown a second room while he was inside the first one. This was what they didn't tell you about power. Not the weight of the decisions. He had always known about that weight, had grown up watching it bend his father's back, had taken it on himself at 19 with the full knowledge of what it cost. The part they didn't tell you was the specific loneliness of being the person in the room who could not stop being that person, who came back from the hardest thing and found the next thing already waiting. He looked at the border markers. He looked at the road ahead, the Iron Fang Road, the road that led back to the capital and the War Council, and the formal process for Magnus and 2 council members who had apparently decided his absence was an opportunity, and the Eastern intelligence files and everything else that was going to demand his full attention from the moment he rode through the gates. He looked at Celine. She was looking at the road too. Then she looked at him. "I know," she said, before he could say anything. "The council members. I know." She held his gaze with those green eyes and the gold ring at the center. "We deal with it. You should have 3 days of rest minimum. The silver exposure. I know what the silver exposure requires," she said, with the patience of a woman who has had this category of conversation before and knows exactly where it ends. "I'm also the person who just destroyed a 3-century-old Lycan containment seal in a mountain. I think I can sit in a council room." He looked at her for a long moment. "I need you to let me handle the council," he said. "The formal process, the political accounting." "I know." "You're not going to stay quiet about the council members." "I'm going to stay appropriately quiet," she said. "Which is different." The corner of her mouth moved, very small. "You handle the judgment. I'll handle the peace afterward." It was the same division they had agreed to in the mountain tunnel, worded differently. The same architecture they had been building for 14 months. Tested continuously and holding continuously, the structure of 2 people who had understood from the beginning that they were not the same kind of force and had chosen to use the difference rather than fight it. He exhaled, long and slow, felt the wound in his side pull at the movement and didn't show it. "Let's go," he said, Arasek. They arrived at the Iron Fang capital at dusk. Word had moved faster than horses. The gates were open, and the garrison was present, and the streets of the capital had the specific quality of a population that had been living with uncertain news for 3 days and was now reading the answer to that uncertainty in the faces of the soldiers coming through the gate. The Luna was back. The King Alpha was back. The state of both of them. Wounded, gray with road dust and fatigue, Darius's right arm visibly not functioning at full capacity, and Celine thinner than she'd left. Told the story of where they had been more plainly than any dispatch could. Darius rode through the gates and did not perform. did not straighten the arm or adjust the posture or put on the version of himself the crowd expected. He was 30 years old, and he had ridden through these gates 100 times after campaigns, and he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the specific depletion of a man who had spent 3 days operating at the outermost limit of everything he had. Celine rode beside him and looked at the crowd, and the crowd looked back at her, and something moved through the gates that was more honest than a ceremony. The War Council was assembled in the main hall, 7 men and 2 women, the remaining senior advisors after Magnus's removal. They stood when he entered. He walked the length of the hall without stopping and took his seat at the head of the table and looked at the faces. One of the 2 council members Hessa had named was at the table. The other had apparently received the relay about the border crossing and had not appeared, which was its own kind of statement. Darius looked at the man who was there, a senior territorial advisor named Corvin, 50 years old, gray-bearded, who had served on the council for 8 years, and who was currently doing an excellent job of maintaining the expression of a loyal council member welcoming his king home. "Corvin," Darius said, my king, I speak for the council in expressing our profound relief at your return, and the Luna's safe. We'll get to that." Darius held his gaze with the amber eyes. "First tell me about the letters." The hall went very quiet. Corvin's expression held for 3 seconds. Then something behind it shifted. The letters were exploratory in nature, not treasonous, simply a conversation about contingency planning in the event that I didn't come back, Darius said. Silence. "In the event that the king's absence became permanent," Corvin said carefully, "it would have been irresponsible not to have considered—" "You discussed succession," Darius said. "Specifically the question of the war commander vacancy and which of you would fill it, and what it would mean for the council's power structure if the king and the Luna were both—" He stopped. Let the word remain unspoken. "You were not planning for the kingdom's continuity. You were planning for your own position in the kingdom's continuity." "My king—" "I'm not asking you to confirm it," Darius said. "I have the letters. I've read the letters. I'm telling you what the letters say so that we're both clear that I'm not operating on a rumor." Corvin was quiet. The hall was very quiet. Darius looked at the faces around the table, 7 other people, some of them meeting his gaze, some of them not. The council had been the governing tissue of the Iron Fang kingdom for 2 generations, the instrument through which the Alpha King's authority was translated into administration, military coordination, territorial management. He had inherited it as he had inherited everything, pre-assembled and battle-tested and carrying the specific institutional history of a structure that had outlasted individuals because it was more useful than any individual alternative. He needed the council. Not Corvin specifically, not the man who had started writing letters about succession on day 2 of his king's absence, but the institution, the function, the mechanism of distributed governance that he had spent 11 years working with, and sometimes against, and understood better than any external observer. He needed the institution. He was also sitting at the head of its table with a wound in his side and a war commander in chains and a mate who had spent 15 minutes in Silver Air destroying a catastrophe that a man on this council's intelligence staff had helped build. The room's silence had a specific quality, the kind that happens when people are waiting to find out what kind of king comes back from the thing that just happened, whether it's the same king or a different one. Whether the experience sharpens the edge or breaks it, or does the third thing, the thing that neither sharpens nor breaks, but changes the fundamental nature of what the edge is for. Darius sat in the silence for a long moment. He thought about what Celine had said, on the road back, about peace after judgment, the division of function. She handled what came after. He thought about what Lucien had said in the chamber. How many decisions have you made, knowing the cost was wrong because the alternative was admitting the first decision had been a mistake? He thought about Magnus, 22 years. He looked at Corvin. "You're removed from the council," he said, "effective now. You'll provide a full account of every communication in those letters and every related communication I don't have yet. You'll do this in writing, under oath, in the process managed by the intelligence captain." He paused. "You will not be charged with treason because what you did exists in the specific gray area between opportunism and active subversion, and I'm not going to prosecute a gray area, but you're done at this table." Corvin opened his mouth, closed it. The second name in the letters, Darius continued to the room, has already demonstrated his judgment by not appearing today. He'll receive the same terms by formal dispatch by morning. He looked around the table. Anyone else at this table who has been having conversations they'd prefer I not know about has until dawn to tell me voluntarily. After dawn, I stop being interested in voluntary disclosure. The faces around the table had the specific quality of people running internal assessments at speed. Good, Darius said. Now, the Draven situation. He briefed the council in the clean, stripped language of a military commander delivering operational summary. No narrative, no interpretation, facts in sequence, outcomes quantified. The Draven operation. The Lycan army's permanent neutralization. The terms agreed with Lucien. Magnus Hale's custody, and upcoming formal process. When he finished, the council had the particular stillness of people who have just absorbed a significant amount of information and are still in the process of restructuring their understanding of the last 3 days. The Luna, said his territorial administrator, a woman named Sella, who had been on the council for 4 years and who Darius had found consistently to be the most reliable person in the room. The ceremony she performed, the implications for the Northern Territories. Ask her, Darius said. She's the authority on that. Celine, seated to his left, looked at Sella directly and gave the full technical account in the specific patient way she gave technical accounts. Complete, accessible, stripped of jargon, leaving the council with a clear understanding of what had existed, what she had done about it, and what the territory looked like now that it was done. When she finished, Sella looked at Darius. She saved the Northern Territories, Sella said. Yes, Darius said. And Iron Fang. Yes. And Draven, for that matter. Yes. Sella looked at Celine with something that was not quite a bow from a seated position, but occupied the same register. Celine received it without expression. Then she looked back at the table. The Eastern Kingdom's Magnus was tracking intelligence on, she said. That's the next problem. Not tonight, but soon. The room looked at her. She's right, Darius said. We work the Draven negotiation first, then the Eastern question. In that order, on a timeline that treats both as urgent. He looked around the table. We're done here for tonight. Dawn briefing on the formal process for Magnus Hale. He stood. The council stood. He walked the length of the hall and did not look at Corvin's empty chair as he passed it, and pushed through the door into the corridor beyond. And Celine was beside him before the door had fully closed, and neither of them said anything for the first 30 steps. Because sometimes the only honest response to the weight of a thing is to carry it in silence until you've carried it far enough to put it down for a few hours. He stopped at the end of the corridor, turned to her. The torchlight in the corridor was warm and ordinary, and nothing in it was silver. 3 days of rest, he said. 2, she said. 3. Darius, you will take 3 days, he said, and his voice had a quality in it that was not command and not request, but was the specific communication of a man who is asking for something from the only position he knows how to ask from, which was stated as a fact because the alternative was something more exposed than he currently had the capacity for. 3 days. Let me deal with Magnus and the council and the Draven dispatch. 3 days where the thing I'm managing is not also the person I need to not be managing. She looked at him for a long moment. 2, she said, and you tell me everything while I rest. Done. They stood in the corridor and the torches burned, and somewhere in the lower part of the fortress, Magnus Hale was being placed in a proper cell with proper guards. And in the council hall, a room full of advisors were rearranging their understanding of what the next several weeks looked like. And outside the walls, the Iron Fang capital was doing the specific thing that cities did after their king came back from something difficult, processing the relief and the questions and the stories that would start being told tomorrow and would keep changing for years. Darius looked at his right arm. He rotated the shoulder carefully. 3 degrees of movement. Maybe 4. Celine watched him do it. 3 days of the compound treatment, she said. You said that already? I'm saying it again. She took the arm, carefully with both hands, a healer's grip rather than a mate's, running her thumbs along the silver damage she could feel through the joint. It will hold. The arm will hold. She looked up at him. You held it for 11 minutes already. The worst part is past. He looked at her hands on his arm. Tell me something, he said, What? When you put your hands on the stone, in the silver air, did you know it would work? The corridor was quiet. She thought about the question with the specific honesty she brought to questions she could have answered more easily with a softer version of the truth. No, she said, but you did it anyway. The alternative was leaving it for someone else to deal with in 20 years. She held his gaze. And I was there, with the right bloodline and the counter method in 15 minutes. A pause. When you have what's needed and you're standing at the exact place where it's needed, what else do you do? He looked at her. He had been told, at 19, when he took the crown, that the hardest part of leadership was making decisions under incomplete information. His father had told him this in the specific way his father communicated anything important, bluntly, without comfort, as though the information was a tool being handed over rather than a truth being shared. You will never have everything you need to make the right call. You will have enough, or you won't. Learn to tell the difference. He had spent 11 years learning to tell the difference. He had also spent 11 years operating on the assumption that the category of enough was a threshold he defined alone, that the judgment of sufficiency was his to make because the crown was his to carry. He had been standing in a silver cloud in a mountain chamber, holding a healer from a rival bloodline upright, while she did the thing only she could do, and the only calculation he had been running was 2 minutes. She had asked for 2 minutes, and he had her wait, and everything else was secondary, not strategic, not managed, not even a decision in the sense of a considered choice. Just 2 minutes. I've got you. He hadn't understood until then what she had meant when she talked about picking up something else alongside the weapons. What you did in that chamber, he said, don't do it without telling me next time. The silver risk. The silver risk, the 15 minutes. The part you calculated before we went down the tunnel and decided not to tell me. She was quiet for a moment. If I had told you, I know. He cut it off, not with anger, with the flat acknowledgement of a man who has run the counterfactual and arrived at the same conclusion she did. I know what I would have done. That doesn't mean you don't tell me. He held her gaze. We don't manage each other. That's the rule. I wasn't managing you. You were protecting the mission from my reaction. A beat of silence. Yes, she said. That's managing me. The corner of her mouth moved. Very small. Not a smile. Something more internal than a smile. The expression of a person recognizing the accuracy of something they'd rather not fully acknowledge. Next time, she said. Next time, he agreed. She kept her hands on his arm for another moment, the healer's grip loosening into something else. Come on, she said. You need the wound cleaned before it decides to become a problem. He followed her down the corridor, and the torches burned behind them, and the fortress held its walls around them, and the night outside was cold and clear, and the blood moon was long past its peak and fading into ordinary dark. In the cells below, Magnus Hale sat with everything he had done and waited for the process that would bring it into light. In a frozen mountain 3 days' ride north, the thing that had slept for 3 centuries was dissolving into silence, unwitnessed and unlamented, just bones and old intent returning to the ground. And in a Draven fortress across a frozen lake, a king with flat silver eyes sat in a room stripped of everything he had spent 4 years building and looked at the space where the architecture had been, and began, for the first time, to think about what to put in its place. Tomorrow, the work of the aftermath would begin. Tonight, the Iron Fang King walked down a corridor behind his Luna and let her lead him somewhere that didn't require his hands to be weapons. And the door at the end of the corridor closed behind them, and the torches burned low, and the kingdom breathed. The formal process for Magnus Hale took 4 days, not because the evidence required 4 days. The letters, the intercepted communications, the intelligence files Cale had compiled over the preceding months, and Magnus's own account, delivered in the flat, exhausted voice of a man who had stopped running, made the picture complete within the first afternoon. It took 4 days because Darius insisted on the process being thorough in a way that the outcome didn't require, but that the institution did. Every accusation documented, every piece of evidence formally entered, every counter-argument Magnus offered, and he offered several, not to deny the essential facts, but to establish the context, the grievance, the specific history that had made him reachable when Lucien's contact found him, recorded in full and acknowledged before being weighed. Darius sat through all of it. He sat at the head of the formal chamber, not the war room, but the judicial room on the fortress's eastern wing, a room used rarely and built for exactly this purpose, with a long table and formal seating and the specific quality of light that came through its narrow, high windows, and fell without warmth on proceedings that required accuracy over comfort. He sat through 4 days of his war commander's account, with the particular stillness of a man who has decided to hear everything before he says anything, and he heard everything. The grievance was real. That was the part he sat with the most. In the evenings after the sessions, when Celine was in the medical wing managing the compound treatment on his arm, and he was alone with the day's records. Magnus's father had been promised a territorial appointment under the previous Iron Fang king, a promise made in a specific context and never honored, buried under the operational priorities of a reign that ran from one campaign to the next, and treated administrative commitments as subordinate to military requirements. The elder Hale had died without the appointment. Magnus had taken the war commander position under Darius with the specific intention of building enough standing to revive the claim. And then years had passed and the claim had remained unraised, and Lucien's contact had found him in the Eastern Campaign's second year with a conversation that offered something cleaner than waiting: certainty, territory, a future that didn't depend on the goodwill of a king who had inherited a promise he didn't know he'd inherited. Darius had not known about the promise. He sat with this for a long time. The specific quality of inheriting a failure you didn't cause, the way the debts of the previous reign had their own half-life, sitting unaddressed in the ledger until the interest compounded into something that reached the present. His father had made a commitment to a man who had served him and had not honored it and had not told his son it existed. Magnus had carried the unaddressed ledger for 22 years and had eventually made a decision that Darius could not forgive, but could, now, fully trace the shape of. Understanding was not absolution. Darius had never confused the two. But understanding changed the nature of the judgment, shifted it from the clean category of pure treachery into the more complicated territory of accumulated failure, where the fault line ran through multiple points, and the question of where it started was not as simple as the question of where it ended. On the 4th day, he rendered the judgment: exile beyond the Deadlands, permanent, with provisions for the journey and nothing further. No execution, no public spectacle, no extended imprisonment that would require the kingdom to continue spending resources on a man whose usefulness to the crown had ended. Magnus stood in the judicial chamber and received the judgment with the face of a man who had known it was coming and had used the 4 days of process to arrive, slowly and without being asked, at something that might eventually become its own kind of accounting. "The territorial appointment," Darius said, when the formal record had been closed. "Your father's claim. I've had it researched." Magnus looked at him. "It was a valid promise, poorly documented, never honored. The failure was my father's administration, not my father personally. The Eastern Territorial Office buried it in a reorganization that happened 6 months after the promise was made, and it never surfaced again." He held the amber gaze steady. "I can't restore what that cost your family. I can acknowledge that it existed and that the Iron Fang crown owed a debt it didn't pay." The judicial chamber was very quiet. "That doesn't change what I did," Magnus said. "No," Darius agreed, "it doesn't." "Then why tell me?" "Because the record should be accurate." He paused. "Because you served this kingdom for 22 years and the last 3 don't erase the 19. They change them. They put a weight on them that everything before has to be carried with now. But they don't erase them." He let that sit. "The exile stands. The acknowledgement stands. Both things are true." Magnus looked at him for a long moment with the face of a man encountering something he hadn't expected and doesn't have a clean category for. He said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say. He was escorted out. Darius sat in the judicial chamber alone for a while after, in the specific quality of quiet that follows a large thing being finished. The records were closed on the table in front of him. The narrow windows put their cold light on the wood grain. Outside, somewhere in the courtyard below, a horse moved and someone called an instruction across the yard, and the ordinary sounds of the fortress continuing its day came through the walls. He thought about his father, about the promise that had sat in a ledger for 2 decades and grown into a catastrophe, about the specific way that unattended obligations had their own gravity, pulling toward consequences that the person who created them would never have predicted and might never have intended. He thought about what it cost to be a king who attended to things, not just the large decisions, the campaigns, the territorial negotiations, the formal judgments, the small ones, the promises that got buried in reorganizations, the men who served well and were owed acknowledgement and didn't receive it because the next crisis was already on the table. He did not have a solution to this. There was no policy that prevented all gaps, no administrative structure that guaranteed every obligation was honored. He was 30 years old, and he had 11 years of reign behind him and an uncertain number ahead of him. And the most honest thing he could say about the management of a kingdom was that it was a practice rather than a solved problem. And the practice required attention that could not be delegated and could not be mechanized and could not be substituted with good intentions. You attended to it or you didn't. And the things you didn't attend to attended to themselves eventually in ways that were rarely preferable. He closed the records and stood up and left the judicial chamber. Celine declared his arm healed on the 5th day. She did it with the specific economy of a professional assessment rather than an announcement, ran her hands along the joint, tested the range, watched his face during the rotation, and noted that the pain register had moved from functional impairment to residual discomfort, and said, "Full mobility in 2 days. The silver traces are metabolized." Then she put the compound materials away and washed her hands at the basin, and that was that. He rotated the shoulder 3 times, full range. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder with an expression that was half assessment and half something else. "You're welcome," she said. They were in the medical wing's private treatment room, which Celine had claimed as her primary workspace in the first week of her arrival at the Iron Fang court, and had never formally been assigned but had simply occupied through the consistent logic of the person who is always there being the person who belongs there. It was organized in the specific way her things were organized, functional and precise, and containing one shelf of personal items that were not medical, 3 books, a small carved figure her grandmother had given her, a length of braided cord that she wore on her wrist during travel and kept on the shelf when she was home. Home. He watched her move through the room and understood with the weight of something that had been true for a long time, but was still worth the recognition that this was what it looked like when a place was home to someone. The ease of movement. The specific unself-consciousness of a person in a space that has absorbed them. She turned and found him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing." "You have a look." "I don't have a look." "You have the look you have when you're thinking something you've decided not to say yet." She crossed her arms. Not defensively. The posture of a woman who is comfortable enough in her position to request information directly. "Say it." He looked at her for a moment. "The council has been asking about your formal title," he said. "Since the Draven operation. Sella raised it in the morning briefing 2 days ago. It's come up 3 times in the administrative correspondence I've reviewed." Celine's expression was careful. "Your position has been Luna," he continued, "mate rank. Recognized in the pack structure but not formalized in the kingdom's legal documentation the way a queen's title would be. The council is suggesting, Sella specifically, but others have agreed, that what happened in the Northern Mountain is a formal act of service to the crown that warrants formal recognition." "I didn't do it as a service to the crown," she said. "I know. I did it because it needed doing." "I know that too." He held her gaze. "The council's reasoning is that the kingdom's documentation should reflect the reality of what happened, that the Luna who negotiated the peace gathering, identified the Draven intelligence gap, performed the counter-ceremony, and contributed substantially to the political resolution of the crisis is not adequately described by the current title structure." Celine was quiet for a moment. "What title?" she said. "Queen, formally, with the full legal standing, territorial authority, council access, the ability to act on crown matters without requiring my co-signature for each instrument." He paused. "Not ceremonial, not symbolic, actual authority documented in the kingdom's legal framework." She looked at him for a long time. "The Arden bloodline," she said. "The council knows it was a technical rival line. Some of the territorial alphas who attended the peace gathering will have opinions," Darius said. "Yes, I've considered this." He kept his voice even. I have also considered that the person being discussed destroyed the most significant military threat the Northern Territories have faced in 3 centuries and negotiated the framework for the first cross-kingdom peace agreement in a generation. If a territorial alpha wants to bring a bloodline objection to that record, I would like to hear them try. The corner of her mouth moved. That's very diplomatic of you, she said. I've been working on it. She looked at the shelf with her 3 books and the carved figure and the braided cord. She looked at her hands, the small burns and cuts of a healer's work, the slightly abraded wrists where the chains had been, the specific marks of a woman who used her hands for consequential things and accepted the evidence of that use. The title doesn't change what I do, she said. No, he agreed. It documents what you already are. She looked at him. I need to think about it, she said. Take the time. That's very unlike you. I told you, working on it. She made a sound that was not quite a laugh but occupied the same space. Then she looked back at her shelf, and the quality of her attention to it was the specific quality of a person sitting inside a moment and feeling its weight without trying to manage it. Ask me again in a week, she said. Done. The Northern Lights came early that winter. They arrived 3 weeks after the return from the Draven Mountain, on a night when the temperature had dropped hard and the sky above the capital had the specific black clarity that only happens when the cold has pushed everything else out of the air. Darius was on the upper wall walk, not on patrol, just there. The way he was sometimes there when the inside of the fortress was too full of the day's business, and the outside of it was simply the outside, cold and clear and indifferent to everything that had been decided within the walls. He heard her come up the steps before she arrived. Knew her footstep pattern from the specific combination of cadence and weight distribution that was exclusively hers. She came through the wall walk door and stood beside him and looked at the sky. The Northern Lights were moving in the way they moved when they were strongest. Not a single sheet, but bands, layered and shifting. The green and pale blue and occasional deep violet of them folding and unfolding across the dark in a slow choreography that had nothing to do with human time or human attention and was happening regardless of whether anyone looked. They stood in the cold and looked at it. The Draven dispatch came back, she said. I saw it. Lucien accepted the framework. I saw that too. The Eastern Territorial Analysis. Kale's team finished the preliminary report. The buildup is real. 3 kingdoms, 5-year coordination, probably 18 months from the point where it becomes an active military question. I know. She looked at the lights. So we have 18 months. Approximately. To build the alliance structure Lucien was trying to force with a catastrophe. She paused. The peace-gathering framework, expanded, formalized, with actual legal and military provision rather than just symbolic attendance. Yes. That's going to require the Arden bloodline's participation, she said, in a formal capacity. The border territories trust the Arden line in ways they don't trust Iron Fang. I know. That's the argument for the title, she said. Functionally, not ceremony. Actual authority to negotiate on behalf of the Crown without the current document structure that requires me to operate through your office for every formal instrument. He looked at her. Was that you thinking about it? He said. That was me finishing thinking about it. She looked back at the sky. Yes. The title. But on specific terms, the authority is real, the documentation is complete, and the Council understands that when I negotiate a territorial agreement, it holds the same weight as one you signed yourself. Those are my terms too. I know. She glanced at him. I wanted to say them out loud so they existed in the air rather than just in the documentation. He looked at her face in the Northern Lights, the green-blue of them moving across her features, the gold ring in her eyes catching the color and holding it, the specific quality of her expression that was neither the professional focus of the healer nor the political precision of the diplomat, but the thing that lived underneath both of those, the unmanaged face she had when there was nothing requiring management. He had been thinking, in the weeks since the Draven Mountain, about what it meant to have been changed by something. Not the dramatic version of change, not the sudden revelation, not the moment of crisis that rewrites a person completely. The other version, which was slower and harder to see from the inside, and which he had resisted for years because the version of himself he had been running on arrival at the throne was functional and battle-tested. and had kept the kingdom intact through 11 difficult years. The version that operated through fear, through dominance as the first and default instrument, through the specific coldness of a man who had learned early that investment in outcomes you couldn't control was a liability, and had built his entire governance philosophy around eliminating that liability wherever possible. He had met her. She had refused to be managed. She had kept refusing, quietly and persistently, and with a patience that had its own kind of steel in it, and the kingdom had started doing something it hadn't done in his father's time, which was begin the long work of becoming something people stayed in by choice rather than something they stayed in by fear. He couldn't say this was better. He couldn't say it was worse. He could say it was harder, in the specific way that things were harder when they required you to hold the outcome loosely rather than grip it into the shape you'd decided on. He was still learning the holding. The ceremony, he said, for the title. I want it to be public. She looked at him. Not a court ceremony, he continued. Outside, the main courtyard, winter moon, all the territorial delegations invited, the ones who attended the peace gathering and the ones who didn't. He paused. I want them to see it. You want them to understand what it means, she said. I want them to understand that the crown is not what it was 11 years ago, that what we're building is not what my father built, that the alliance structure we're asking them to join has a different center of gravity than the one that has been asking them for tribute and military cooperation for 2 generations. He held her gaze. You are that difference. Not me. Me they understand. I'm the threat they've always known. You're the thing they don't have a category for yet, and I want to give it a name in front of all of them. She was quiet for a long moment. The northern lights moved above them. The cold was absolute and clear. Somewhere below the walls, a watch rotation changed, and boots rang on stone in the specific rhythm of a garrison that had not been asked to fight anything tonight and was simply present, simply doing the ordinary work of keeping the walls. I'm not a symbol, she said. No, he agreed. That's exactly why it works. She looked at the lights for a while longer. Winter moon, she said. That's 3 weeks. Approximately. I need 2 of those weeks for the Draven framework documentation and the preliminary contacts with the border territories for the expanded gathering. She was already running the calendar. He could see it. The 3rd week for the ceremony preparation and the delegation arrivals. That's fine. And I want Sela managing the ceremonial protocol, not the war council, not the military staff. Done. She exhaled, long and slow, the breath of someone setting something down that they have been carrying at arm's length while they decided whether to pick it up properly. Okay, she said. He looked at her. Okay, he said. The winter moon ceremony was everything and nothing like what ceremony usually was in the Iron Fang Kingdom. Everything, because the scale of it was real. 14 territorial delegations in the courtyard, representatives from 3 former enemy packs standing beside representatives from Iron Fang's oldest allied bloodlines, the garrison in full formation along the walls, the capital's population filling the courtyard edges, and the streets beyond in the specific density of people who understand they are present at something that will be described later in terms of before and after. Nothing like the usual, because it had none of the performed distance that Iron Fang ceremonies had carried for 2 generations. No architecture of intimidation, no demonstration of military capacity staged for the watching delegations. No speech about the kingdom's strength designed to remind the audience of what they were dealing with. Darius stood at the center of the courtyard in the winter moonlight and looked at the faces in front of him and said what was true. Not a prepared address, not a drafted diplomatic document read from a formal position. He had spent 3 evenings in the week before trying to write it out and had burned all 3 drafts because they sounded like a king who was trying to explain something, and what he wanted was a king who had understood something and was saying it plainly. He stood in the cold courtyard and said it plainly. He said that the Iron Fang Kingdom had been built on the premise that strength was the only language every enemy understood. He said he had believed this and governed by it, and that it had kept the kingdom intact through circumstances that would have broken a different approach. He said it was incomplete. Not wrong. Incomplete. The way a map that shows only roads is not wrong about the roads, but is incomplete about the territory. He said that the woman standing to his left had been teaching him the rest of the map for 14 months, and that the northern mountain had been the examination, and that the result was a kingdom that was still standing, and an ancient threat that was permanently resolved because she had walked into a frozen chamber in silver air with a counter ceremony she had memorized from her grandmother's library and had held on to the work until it was done. He said that the title he was giving her was not a reward, it was a description. The crown naming the reality that already existed because the Iron Fang kingdom was not the same kingdom it had been 18 months ago, and the person most responsible for that was not him. He took the crown from the formal case, not an Iron Fang crown. Celine had been specific about this, and he had understood why, had understood the precise political intelligence of it. Not the Iron Fang line's symbol of authority placed on a head from a rival bloodline. Something new. Sela had commissioned it in the 3 weeks of preparation. Winter steel, the blue-black metal of the northern ranges, shaped into something that had no precedent in the existing heraldic record and therefore belonged to no previous arrangement of power. He placed it on her head in the winter moonlight with his healed right hand steady and his left at his side, and the courtyard was completely silent, and the northern lights were faint on the horizon in the specific way they appeared when they were far away but present. She stood in the moonlight with the crown on her head and looked at the 14 delegations and the garrison and the faces in the crowd. She didn't perform this either. She looked at them the way she looked at everything, with the direct attention of a healer who is actually seeing what is in front of her rather than the version she expected to find. She looked at the former enemy pack standing in the Iron Fang courtyard, men and women whose losses in previous campaigns stood between them and this moment as a weight that no ceremony could lift but that the ceremony could at least acknowledge the existence of. She said, "I know what it costs some of you to be here." The courtyard held its breath. "I know the Iron Fang name is not a simple thing for every person in this yard. I know the history doesn't get erased by a winter moon ceremony and a new title. I'm not asking you to erase it." She let the silence hold for a moment. "I'm asking you to build something in front of it, something that your children and your children's children look at instead of looking only at the history. That's the work. That's what the next 18 months are for." She looked at the crowd, steady, present, without performance. "I'm the Moon Queen of Iron Fang. I'm also a healer from the Arden bloodline who has spent the last year and a half eating at tables with your people and treating your sick and listening to everything you were willing to say. Both of those things are true. I intend to keep using both." She stopped. The courtyard stayed quiet for 3 seconds. Then the sound that started at the edges and moved inward. Not organized, not ceremonial, not the formal acknowledgement that protocol required, but the specific sound of a crowd of people who have decided, each individually, to make the same noise at the same time. The delegations, even the former enemies, even the packs who had lost sons to Iron Fang campaigns and had come to this courtyard with their history sitting on their shoulders. Even them, not all the way, not cleanly, but some of them, the ones who had been watching the year's work and understood what it had been building toward. Darius stood beside her and listened to the sound and felt, in the specific deep register of a man who has spent his adult life in rooms where the sound of a crowd was either a threat assessment or a victory indicator, something he did not have a previous category for. Not triumph. Not the clean satisfaction of a campaign concluded and a kingdom secured. Something slower than triumph. Something that required more of him than triumph had ever required, because triumph could be held at arm's length, catalogued, assessed, moved past in preparation for the next requirement. This asked for presence, asked him to actually be in the courtyard, in the winter cold, beside the woman he had handed a crown that meant the thing he meant it to mean, and to understand that the sound around them was the sound of something beginning rather than something concluded. He had spent 11 years building walls. He understood, standing in the winter moonlight, that what came next was different in a way that was not less demanding, but was demanding of different things. The walls were not coming down. He was not naive about what the world required from a king, would never be naive about that. The Eastern threat was real, and 18 months was not a long runway, and the work ahead was complicated and costly and would not always be clean. He did not believe in easy peace. He did not believe that goodwill erased strategic reality. He believed in the woman beside him, who did not believe in easy peace either, who had walked into a mountain chamber in silver air specifically because the alternative was leaving the problem for someone else, and who was standing in a winter courtyard telling 14 delegations that the work was the work and she intended to do it. He had spent most of his reign being the thing people were afraid of. He was beginning to understand that there was a longer memory in the world than fear. Fear remembered you while it needed to. Love, or the harder thing, the thing that was not quite love and not quite loyalty, but lived in the space where both of them met the practical reality of being a person in a world that was capable of being better than it was. That thing stayed past the threat. That thing showed up in the third and fourth generation. That thing was what you built when you stopped building walls and started building the reason to stay inside them. He was 30 years old. He was learning. The ceremony ended the way the best endings did, not with a single definitive moment, but with a gradual dissolution. The formal structure giving way to the ordinary human business of people standing in a courtyard in winter cold and deciding to stay a little longer, to speak to someone from a delegation they'd been watching from a distance, to accept a cup of something warm from the tables along the yard's edges. Celine moved through it the way she moved through everything, present, specific, actually there for each conversation rather than performing presence. He watched her from the wall walk where he'd gone to let the crowd breathe, and saw her with the representative from the Arden border territories, a man who had known her grandmother and was talking with the particular quality of someone who is telling a young person what the person they loved was like before the young person knew them. Saw her with one of the former enemy delegation heads, a quiet-faced woman who had lost a brother in the Third Territorial War, and who was looking at Celine with the specific expression of someone who is recalibrating an expectation. Saw Kale at the courtyard's edge, running his perpetual assessment of the space, catching Darius's eye on the wall walk and giving the small nod that meant secure, nothing to manage. Saw Selah in conversation with 3 territorial administrators, the specific animated focus of a person doing the work she was built for. Saw his kingdom doing the thing that kingdoms could do when the person at the top stopped requiring them to be only one thing. Darius stood on the wall walk in the winter cold and breathed. The northern lights had strengthened while the ceremony ran. They were full above the capital now, the bands of green and blue moving in their ancient indifferent choreography, the cold amplifying them, the dark of the northern sky giving them the space they needed to be what they were. He had grown up under these lights, had seen them from campaign positions in the eastern marshlands and the northern mountain passes and the river crossings of the southern territories, had seen them from the wall walk of this fortress on hundreds of nights. They had always been background, part of the landscape of being in the north, catalogued and set aside. Standing above the winter moon ceremony in his changed kingdom, he looked at them and let them be what they were, enormous and uncontrollable and present without requiring anything from him, the sky doing the thing the sky did regardless of what happened under it. He stood there until Celine came up the wall walk steps. She stood beside him. The crown caught the northern lights and gave them back in the blue-black steel's own register. 14 delegations, she said. 14. 3 former enemies. 3. That's a start, she said. It is, he agreed. She looked at the lights for a while. Then, Magnus will be at the Deadlands border by morning. I know. How are you with that? He considered the question with the specific honesty she had been asking for from him since the beginning, the version of honesty that didn't hide behind strategy or operational language. Not settled, he said. Not going to be settled. It happened, and the process happened, and the outcome is what it is, and I will carry the shape of it for a long time. He paused. I think that's correct. I think the version of me that would be settled about it would be a man I'd like less. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. That's right. They stood in the cold above the courtyard where the crowd was still moving in its slow dissolution, the conversation still running, the 14 delegations still present in the space they had traveled to because someone had built a year's worth of reason to come. The Eastern question, she said. 18 months. I want to start the border contacts next week. I know you do. Is that all right? He looked at her. The question had a texture to it. Not asking permission, never that, but the version of asking that 2 people do when they have built something together and understand that the building continues to require both of them. Yes, he said. That's all right? She nodded. The northern lights moved above them. The kingdom breathed below. The winter moon hung in the specific place it always hung and gave its light without asking anything for it, The same light it had given to every generation of wolves who had stood on these walls and looked up and understood, each in their own way, that the world was not made for any single version of it, and that the best thing a person could do was attend to the version in front of them with everything they had. Darius Vane put his healed right hand at the small of Celine Arden's back, and she leaned into him by exactly the amount that acknowledged it, and they stood together on the wall walk above the winter moon ceremony and looked at the lights and said nothing, because nothing was required. The Iron Fang kingdom had been built on the premise that strength was the only language every enemy understood. It was still strong. It would need to be. The world ahead was not simple, and the next 18 months would ask hard things from both of them, and the Eastern question was real, and the work of the expanded alliance was complicated, and there would be nights where the walls required everything they had, and days where the diplomacy would cost more than the fighting had. But the kingdom that faced those things was not the kingdom that had existed 2 years ago. It was something that had never quite existed before in this territory. Not a conquered peace, not a peace held at sword's point, not the brittle quiet of populations too afraid to move. Something that had been built from the bottom by a woman who worked constantly and ate at tables with the people others had written off as enemies and remembered names and treated the sick and believed, with the specific unfashionable stubbornness of someone who has looked at how badly things can go and decided to attempt the alternative anyway, that the work was worth doing because the alternative was leaving it for someone else. The legends would remember the King Alpha who had crossed borders in wolf form and torn through fortresses to bring back his Luna. That was true. That had happened. The rage and the speed and the particular terror of a man who had nothing left to lose and was moving north regardless had been real and would remain real as long as the stories ran. But the thing that would outlast the legend, the thing that took root in the third and fourth generation, in the children of the delegations who had stood in the winter courtyard and watched a moon queen from a rival bloodline tell them the work was the work, and she intended to do it, was quieter than the legend and harder to see and more permanent than any fortress Darius had ever built. The northern lights moved. The kingdom held. The wall walk was cold and clear and exactly itself, and the two people standing on it were not finished with what they were building, would not be finished for a very long time, but had arrived at the particular threshold where the foundation was real enough to build from. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.